The ocean is not merely water, it is a veil, a covering for things that are not meant to be seen. On the night of September 22, 1979, the southern hemisphere of Earth was wrapped in a darkness so absolute that it felt prehistoric. There were no ships traversing the specific coordinates of 47 degrees south, 40 degrees east. There were no commercial flight paths crossing the ionosphere above it. It was a void within the map of the world, a stretch of the South Atlantic and Indian Ocean convergence that belongs to no one, where the waves are cold, gray, and endless. But high above this emptiness, 70,000 miles into the vacuum of space, a machine was watching. It was not a modern machine. It was an aging Sentinel, a piece of American hardware known as Vela Hotel 6911. It had been drifting in its high orbit for years, spinning slowly, its sensors pointed downward like a vigilant, unsleeping eye. Its job was singular. Its job was specific. Its job was to watch for the one thing that should never happen again. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight with the data stream that should have remained zeros, because at 1 hour past midnight, Zulu time, the sensors on Vela 6911 did not register the darkness of the ocean. They did not register the reflection of the moon. For a fraction of a second, in the deepest silence of the Cold War, the satellite saw a sunrise where no sun existed. It was a flash so bright, so distinct, and so chemically precise that it triggered an automatic alarm in a buried bunker thousands of miles away. The machine woke up, and the world changed. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink is faded with secrets. We are entering the archive of the impossible. Tonight, we drift back to 1979, to the moment the United States government realized they had lost control of the nuclear narrative. Relax your mind. Let the static of the modern world fade away. We are going to analyze the signal. We are going to deconstruct the anomaly. To understand the fear, we must first understand the eye that saw it. The Vela program was not designed for exploration. It was designed for paranoia, born from the terrifying escalation of the 1960s. The Vela satellites were the United States insurance policy against the Soviet Union. Their name, Vela, comes from the Spanish verb, vela, to watch, to keep vigil, and that is exactly what Vela 6911 did. It sat in a high-altitude orbit, far beyond the clutter of lower satellites, staring unblinkingly at the surface of the planet. It was equipped with instruments known as bomb emitters. These were not cameras in the traditional sense. They were photodiode sensors designed to detect intense pulses of light, specifically, the kind of light that can only be created by the splitting of an atom. A nuclear explosion is not just a fireball, it is a physics event with a fingerprint. It has a signature, and Vela 6911 knew that signature better than any human being. The engineers who built Vela knew that lightning strikes. They knew that meteors burn up in the atmosphere. They knew that sunglints off the ocean waves could mimic a flash. So, they programmed the satellite to look for something very specific. A nuclear detonation does not flash once. It flashes twice. This is the physics of the apocalypse. When a nuclear device detonates, the initial release of energy is so intense, so hot, that it superheats the air around it instantly. This creates the first flash, a blinding release of thermal X. But then, for a microsecond, the shockwave expands so fast that it becomes opaque. It actually hides the fireball behind a wall of compressed air. The light dims. Then, as the shockwave cools and becomes transparent again, the fireball re-emits, larger, expanding, glowing with the heat of a star. This is the second flash. Two peaks of light, one fast, one slow. The double flash, this double hump signature, is the holy grail of nuclear surveillance. Nothing in nature mimics it. Lightning is a single chaotic spike. A meteor is a long burning trail. Only a nuclear bomb creates the double flash. It is the mathematical proof of destruction. And for years, Vela 6911 stared at the Earth and saw nothing but the random noise of the universe. It saw lightning storms over Brazil. It saw solar reflections off the Pacific. But the double flash remained theoretical. Until that September night. At 1 a.m. UTC. The sensors on Vela 6911 were scanning the Prince Edward Islands region. This is an area of the world that is aggressively lonely. It is situated between the bottom tip of Africa and the frozen shelf of Antarctica. The waters here are known as the Roaring Forties and the Furious Fifties due to the violence of the winds. It is a place where ships vanish. It is a place where there are no witnesses. The satellite was old. It had been launched in May 1969. By 1979, it was operating well past its intended lifespan. Its electromagnetic sensors were degraded. Its memory banks were tired, but its eyes, the bong meters, were still sharp. Suddenly, the telemetry spiked. The data came in as a stream of binary code, beamed from the silent vacuum of space down to the tracking stations on Earth. It wasn't a glitch. It wasn't a flicker. The sensors recorded an intense, blinding flash of light rising from the surface of the ocean. The intensity was off the charts. The bong meter saturated, then recovered. A fraction of a second passed. The light dimmed. The shock wave was expanding, hiding the core dot. Then, the second flash, longer, brighter, unmistakable. Vela 6911 recorded the event and tagged it with the highest priority alert. It packaged the data. It sent the signal home. In the United States. Inside the windowless rooms of the Air Force Technical Applications Center, AFTAC at Patrick Air Force Base in Florida, the printers began to chatter. The machines that monitored the health of the world began to spit out a diagnosis of fire. Analysts, coffee in hand, working the graveyard shift, looked at the strip charts. They looked at the double hump. They looked at the coordinates. Latitude 47 degrees south, longitude 40 degrees east. They looked at the map. There was nothing there. No military base. No city. No known testing ground. Just water, wind, and the dark. The implications were immediate and terrifying. If the data was correct, someone had just detonated a nuclear weapon in the open ocean. But who? The Soviet Union conducted their tests in Semipalatinsk, deep within their own landmass. The French tested in the Pacific Atoll. The Chinese tested at Lopnor, Britain, and the US had stopped atmospheric testing years ago. Bound by treaties they had sworn to uphold. This explosion had no flag. It had no warning. It was an orphan bomb, exploding in the blind spot of the world. The analysts at AFTAC checked the health of the satellite. Was Vela 6911 malfunctioning? Was this a zoo event, a term used for unexplained signals caused by micrometeoroids hitting the sensor? They ran diagnostics. The satellite reported back. Systems nominal. The sensors were working. The sensitivity was calibrated. The realization settled in the room like a heavy fog. This was not a glitch. This was an event. And if it was an event, it meant that the delicate balance of the Cold War, the carefully managed stalemate of mutually assured destruction, had just been breached by a ghost. The phone lines began to ring in Washington. It was still night in the capital. The president was asleep. The national security advisor was asleep. But the data was awake. The data was traveling up the chain of command, moving from the technicians to the generals, from the generals to the intelligence community. We have a double flash. The voice on the secure line said. Southern Indian Ocean yield estimated between 2 and 3 kilotons, 2 to 3 kilotons, small. Tactical, a weapon designed not to destroy a city, but to test a capability. Or perhaps, a weapon designed to be hidden. The data packet from Vela 6911 was not a simple text message. It was a complex array of voltage readings, timestamps, and sensor health diagnostics. The analysts at AFTAC had to peel back the layers of this digital onion. They had to look at the bong meter readings in isolation. The first sensor, YC, had triggered. The second sensor, YV, had triggered. This coincidence was critical. If only one sensor had seen the flash, it could have been a cosmic ray hitting the detector of false positive known as a singlet. But both sensors, positioned on different parts of the spinning satellite, had registered the event simultaneously. The probability of two random cosmic rays hitting two separate sensors at the exact same microsecond was statistically infinite. It was, for all intents and purposes, 0. The analysts looked at the yield estimation again. 2 to 3. To put that in perspective, the bomb dropped on Hiroshima was approximately 15 kg. This explosion was significantly smaller. It was a fizzle, or perhaps a very sophisticated, miniaturized neutron device. A weapon designed to kill living tissue with radiation while leaving infrastructure intact. Or, it was a test of a trigger mechanism for a much larger thermonuclear hydrogen bomb. The timing was also suspicious. 1 a.m. UTC, in the South Atlantic. This was deep night. Pitch black. The cloud cover was heavy. Whoever did this, if someone did this, chose the moment of maximum obscurity. They chose a time when the world was looking the other way. They chose a location that was technically nowhere. The silence of the location was its own kind of evidence. The Prince Edward Islands are owned by South Africa. They are volcanic, uninhabited, and hostile. The nearest other landmass involves the Crozet Islands, owned by France. Further south lies the Bouvet Island, owned by Norway, the most remote island on planet Earth. This was a neighborhood of ghosts, a place where nations held territory but no population. a place where international law became blurry, because there was no one around to enforce it. The AFDAC team began to cross-reference Vela data with other listening posts. The United States maintains a global network of hydroacoustic sensors underwater, microphones designed to listen for Soviet submarines. If a bomb went off near the surface of the ocean, the sound waves would couple with the water. They would travel for thousands of miles through the SOFAR channel, a layer of water that acts like a waveguide for sound. They checked the hydrophones on Ascension Island. They checked the sensors at Wake Island. They waited for the speed of sound to carry the truth to them. Sound travels through water at approximately 1,500 meters per second. It is slow compared to light. While the flash arrived instantly, the rumble would take hours. While they waited, the political machinery began to turn. The information was formatted into a critic messenger communication with the highest priority processing speed in the US government. A critic message overrides everything. It clears the lines. It wakes up the heavy sleepers. Within minutes, the alert was on its way to the National Security Council. The President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, was a man of science. He was a nuclear engineer by training. He had served in the Navy on nuclear submarines. Of all the presidents in history, he was perhaps the only one who could look at the raw data of a bong meter readout and understand the physics of what he was seeing without an interpreter. When the briefing reached him, the implication was personal. Carter had built his presidency on the promise of He was pushing for the SALT treaty with the Soviets. He was trying to broker peace in the Middle East with the Camp David Accords. A secret nuclear test, conducted by an unknown actor, was a direct knife to the heart of his foreign policy. It suggested that the nuclear club was expanding. It suggested that the safeguards had failed. But there was a problem. A nuclear explosion creates fallout. It creates radioactive isotopes iodine-131, cesium-137, strontium-90. These particles are swept up into the atmosphere and carried by the trade winds. They are the chemical signature that proves the crime. The flash was the visual evidence, but the fallout was the forensic evidence. The Air Force immediately ordered the launch of WC-135 aircraft. These are modified Boeing stratolifters, equipped with air sampling scoops on the sides of the fuselage. They are the SNEVs. Their mission was to fly from the Ascension Island Air Base, traverse the South Atlantic, and punch through the clouds at the coordinates Vela had identified. They were to suck in the air and trap the particles on filter paper. Narration: the planes took off. The pilots flew into the storm systems of the southern hemisphere. They flew grid patterns over the empty ocean, battling turbulence, listening to the drone of the engines for hours on end. They were hunting for invisible dust. They were hunting for the debris of a split atom. But as the hours turned into days, the reports came back from the labs. Filter paper, clean. Radiation levels, normal background. Iodine 131, negative. The paradox deepened. Vela 6911 shouted bomb. The physics of the double flash shouted bomb, but the air sniffers whispered nothing. How could you have a nuclear explosion without radiation? Was it a clean bomb, a neutron bomb, or was the wind simply wrong? Had the plume been washed out by the heavy rains before the planes could get there? Or, and this was the fear that began to grow in the back of the intelligence community's mind, was the satellite wrong? If the satellite was wrong, it was a technical failure. If the satellite was right, and the fallout was missing, it was a scientific mystery. But if the satellite was right, and the fallout was being hidden or missed, that was a conspiracy. The skepticism began to mount. The scientific community is built on You cannot claim a discovery based on one data point from an aging satellite. The naysayers began to propose alternative theories. Theory 1. A tiny grain of space dust, traveling at 20,000 miles per hour, had struck the satellite. The impact created a small shower of plasma debris from the satellite's own skin that reflected sunlight into the sensors. This could explain the flash. But could it explain the double hump? The experts ran simulations. A meteoroid impact is a single flash. To get a double flash, the meteoroid would have to hit, create a cloud, clear away, and then hit again. Or perhaps a rotating piece of debris reflected the sun twice. It was a stretch. It was physically possible, but statistically absurd. Theory 2. The region was known for storms. Could a massive bolt of lightning, perhaps a sprite or a jet firing upwards from the clouds into the ionosphere, have triggered the sensors? Vela had seen thousands of lightning bolts. It knew what lightning looked like. Lightning is jagged. It rises and falls in intensity chaotically. It does not follow the smooth, predictable curve of a fireball expanding and cooling. The lightning theory was weak. but it was comforting. Lightning is natural. Lightning does not violate treaties. Theory 3. A zoo event. This is the catch-all term for we don't know. A glitch in the matrix. A cosmic ray hitting a memory chip and flipping a bit from 0 to 1. A phantom signal in the electronic brain of the machine. Narration. But the men who built the bong meters refused to accept the glitch theory. They knew their machine. They pointed to the calibration data. Vela 6911 had detected 41 previous nuclear tests. In every single one of those 41 cases, the satellite had been correct. It had never cried wolf. It had never hallucinated a double flash. Its track record was perfect. 41 for 41. Why would it choose September 22, 1979, to lie for the first time? And then there was the other evidence. The evidence that didn't come from the sky, but from the water. While the Air Force sniffers were finding nothing in the air, the Navy was listening to the deep. The hydroacoustic data from the sensors near Ascension Island and Crozet Island began to be processed. The speed of sound had finally carried the message across the ocean. The Navy analysts saw it. A distinct, low-frequency acoustic signal, a T-phase wave. This is a type of sound wave that travels efficiently through the ocean channel. The timing of the signal matched the Vela flash perfectly. The triangulation of the sound pointed to the same empty spot in the Indian Ocean. Something had slapped the water hard. So now you had two witnesses, the eye in the sky and the ear in the sea, the visual flash and the hydroacoustic thump. The probability of a satellite glitch happening at the exact same second as an underwater anomaly was no longer just improbable. It was impossible. The zoo event theory was dead. The meteoroid theory was dying. The reality of the bomb was solidifying. But if it was a bomb, where was the cloud? Where was the mushroom? And more importantly, who was the architect? The eyes of the intelligence community turned to the only two nations in the region capable of such an act. One was South Africa, isolated, under apartheid, sanctioned by the world, and desperate for a deterrent against the total onslaught they believed was coming. The other was Israel, a nation with a policy of nuclear ambiguity, a nation that needed to test its weapons but lacked the landmass to do it. Rumors of a secret alliance began to circulate. Project Circle, a handshake in the dark, a trade of uranium for technology, a test conducted in the most remote place on Earth to ensure that no one would know. But they forgot one thing. They forgot that the United States never stops watching. They forgot about the old, tired satellite drifting 70,000 miles above their heads. The file on Vela 6911 was opened on that morning in September, and it has never truly been closed. The event became a ghost story within the intelligence community. The scientists saw a bomb. The politicians saw a diplomatic nightmare. The result was a collision between truth and convenience. To admit there was a bomb was to admit a failure of policy. It was to force the president to sanction allies. It was to admit that the nuclear genie was out of the bottle and dancing in the southern hemisphere. So, a new narrative had to be constructed. A narrative of ambiguity. A narrative of inconclusive data. But the data remains. The double flash remains etched in the magnetic tapes of the 1979 archives. The hydroacoustic signal remains in the Navy logs. The 1 a.m. signal stands as a testament to the fact that even in the middle of nowhere, even in the deepest dark of the ocean, there are no secrets. The satellite woke up, it saw the fire, and then the world decided to close its eyes. But what exactly constitutes a double flash? Why is this specific pattern the unbreakable signature of a nuclear event? To understand the cover-up, we must first master the physics. We must look at the light itself. Light is usually interpreted as a visual experience. We see a sunrise, we see a candle flicker, we see the flash of a camera. But to a physicist, light is not an experience. Light is data. It is a stream of photons traveling at a constant speed, carrying with it the precise history of its origin. Every source of light in the universe, from a dying star to a striking match, has a fingerprint, a spectral identity that cannot be forged. In the world of high-stakes espionage, humans lie. Governments redact documents, spies burn tapes, but photons do not have loyalties. They do not have political agendas. When an atom is split in anger or in testing, it releases a cry of energy, so specific, so mathematically complex, that it is impossible to mimic in nature. This is the story of that signature. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight by opening the technical manual of the apocalypse. We are going to deconstruct the light that Vela 6911 saw. We are going to understand why a machine, drifting alone in the cold silence of space, knew more about the truth than the men in the Situation Room. We are going to look at the double flash. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets. You are safe here. The events of 1979 cannot touch you. We are simply observers, analyzing the physics of a ghost. Let your breathing slow down to the rhythm of the data stream. We are entering the domain of the Los Alamos National Laboratory, where the detectors were born. To understand the double flash, we must first understand the instrument. The eye of the Vela satellite was not a camera. A camera is easily fooled. A camera captures an image, but an image can be blurry. It can be overexposed. Instead, the Vela satellites used bong meters. The name bong meter is an inside joke among the scientists who built it. Bang is the Hindi word for cannabis. The joke was that you would have to be high on bang to believe that this tiny sensor could detect a nuclear explosion from 70,000 miles away. But the engineering was sober, precise, and brilliant. The bong meter is it measures the intensity of light over time. It doesn't care what the explosion looks like. It cares how the brightness changes millisecond by millisecond. It records a graph, and in that graph lies the undeniable proof of nuclear fission. Imagine you are standing in a pitch-black room, and someone strikes a match. The light flares up, reaches a peak, and then slowly dies down. On a graph, this would look like a single mountain peak, up and then down. Now, imagine a lightning bolt. It is jagged, it flickers, up, down, chaotic and fast. Now, imagine a meteor entering the atmosphere. It glows faintly, gets brighter and brighter as it burns, and then vanishes. A slow, steady curve. A nuclear bomb does none of these things. A nuclear bomb breaks the rules of standard combustion. It creates a shape that looks like the letter M. To peaks. One valley. This is the double flash. And to understand why it happens, we have to slow down time to the microsecond. Let us reconstruct the first second of the explosion detected by Vela 6911. Time 0. The trigger fires. The conventional explosives compress the plutonium core. Criticality is reached. The chain reaction begins. In less than a millionth of a second. The temperature inside the bomb casing rises to tens of millions of degrees. This is hotter than the center of the sun. At this temperature, matter ceases to exist as we know it. It becomes plasma. The bomb casing, the metal, the electronics, they don't just melt, they vaporize into X-rays. This is the first flash. The energy is released primarily as thermal X. These X-rays fly out from the core at the speed of light. They slam into the surrounding air molecules, the nitrogen and oxygen of the atmosphere. The energy is so intense that it instantly superheats the air, turning the atmosphere itself into a glowing ball of fire. This fireball is what Vela 6911 saw first. A massive, instantaneous spike of brightness. This is the first peak of the M. It lasts only a millisecond. It is a blinding, screaming release of pure thermal radiation. But then, physics does something strange. Something counter-intuitive. The light goes out. Why does the light die? The bomb hasn't stopped exploding. The energy hasn't disappeared. The answer lies in the concept of opacity. When the initial X-rays hit the air, they create a shockwave. This shockwave is expanding outward at thousands of miles per hour. It is moving faster than the speed of sound. This wall of compressed air is so dense, and so energized, that it becomes opaque to visible light. It acts like a shutter. It acts like a heavy iron curtain falling over a window. The fireball is still burning inside, hotter than ever, but the shockwave around it has trapped the light. The photons cannot escape. They are absorbed by the ionized air of the shock front. To an observer or to a satellite, the explosion seems to dim. The brightness drops rapidly. This is the valley between the two peaks. This is the dip in the M. This phase is known as the hydrodynamic separation. It is a quiet moment in the chaos, a pause. For a fraction of a second, the nuclear ghost hides itself behind a cloak of shockwaves. This is the critical test. Lightning does not have a hydrodynamic separation. A meteor does not generate a shockwave dense enough to block its own light. Only a nuclear explosion creates this specific physical phenomenon. The sheer violence of the energy release creates its own prison, but the prison cannot hold. As the shockwave expands, it begins to cool. It loses energy. The air molecules relax. The shutter begins to open. The opacity drops, and suddenly, the fireball inside which has been expanding and churning this whole time becomes visible again. Narration. This is the second flash. The shockwave becomes transparent. The glowing heart of the explosion is revealed once more, but this time, the light is different. It is not the sharp, hard X-rays of the first millisecond. It is the thermal glow of the expanding fireball. It is larger, slower, and lasts much longer. It rises to a second maximum brightness, and then slowly fades away as the fireball rises into the sky to form the mushroom cloud. The graph is complete. Peak 1, the X-ray slam. The valley, the shockwave shutter. Peak 2, the fireball expansion. Vela 6911 saw this. It saw the peak, it saw the valley. It saw the second peak that the sensors on the satellite recorded the timing of the valley. In a nuclear explosion, the time between the first and second flash is directly related to the yield or the power of the bomb. A bigger bomb has a longer valley because the shockwave takes longer to cool. A smaller bomb has a shorter valley. The analysts measured the gap. It was short. The calculation was precise. The math said 2 to 3 kilotons. This number was uncomfortable. It was too small to be a superpower's strategic weapon. It was too large to be a conventional accident. It fit perfectly into the profile of a trigger test, a low detonation used to verify that a design works. Before building a bigger one, the skeptics in Washington, desperate to avoid a diplomatic crisis, tried to attack the physics. They asked, could it be something else? Could it be a meteoroid hitting the satellite? Let us dismantle the meteoroid theory with the cold logic of the bong meter. The theory proposed that a tiny piece of space dust hit the satellite, knocking loose a flake of paint or metal. This flake drifted in front of the sensor, reflecting sunlight. Then, perhaps, the flake tumbled, hiding the light the valley, and then reflected it again the second peak. It sounds plausible to a politician. It sounds impossible to an engineer. Vela 6911 had two bong. Let's call them sensor A and sensor B. They were mounted on different sides of the satellite body. They were looking at the same scene but through different eyes. If a paint flake floated in front of sensor A, it would block sensor A's view, but sensor B, located inches away, would see nothing. The graph would show a signal on one line and a flat line on the other. But the data from September 22, 1979 showed the double flash on both sensors simultaneously. For the meteoroid theory to be true, two separate paint flakes would have to detach at the exact same moment. They would have to drift in front of two separate lenses at the exact same speed. They would have to tumble in perfect synchronization to create the exact same valley and the exact same second peak. The probability of this happening is not just low, it is astronomical. It is like flipping a coin 10,000 times and getting heads every single time, while simultaneously being struck by lightning. The sensors were calibrated to reject noise. They were built with coincidence logic. This meant that unless both sensors agreed, the satellite would not trigger an alert. The system was designed to be pessimistic. It was designed to assume that any single signal was a glitch. It only believed in pairs. On that night, the pair agreed. The engineers at Los Alamos examined the rise time. This is the speed at which the light goes from 0 to maximum brightness. In a nuclear explosion, this happens in nanoseconds. It is instant. In a zoo event, a micrometeoroid impact, the rise time is slower. The plasma from an impact takes time to expand. It is smeared out over microseconds. The Vela data showed a rise time that was it was a vertical wall of light. It matched the nuclear profile, not the impact profile. Furthermore, there is the issue of color, or rather, spectral intensity. The bong meters were sensitive to specific wavelengths. A nuclear fireball radiates as a black body, a perfect emitter of thermal radiation. As the fireball cools, the spectrum shifts from X-ray to ultraviolet to visible to infrared. The sensors detected this shift. They watched the temperature of the event drop. A reflection from a paint flake does not cool down. It just reflects sunlight, which has a constant temperature. A meteor burning up gets hotter, not cooler. Only an expanding fireball starts at millions of degrees and cools down to thousands of degrees in a predictable curve. The Vela data showed cooling. It showed the physics of a dying star, momentary and small, born in the emptiness of the Indian Ocean. So we have the double flash, we have the dual sensor confirmation, we have the rise time, we have the cooling curve. The physics is a fortress. It is a locked room of evidence. And yet, the political narrative began to chip away at the walls. Enter the Ruina panel. President Carter, facing an election and a fragile international landscape, convened a panel of distinguished scientists headed by Jack Ruina from MIT. Their mandate was to review the data. Their unwritten mandate, many suspected, was to find a way out, to find an alternative explanation. The Ruina panel was a collection of brilliant minds, but they were working backward from a conclusion. They were looking for the zoo event. They pored over the data looking for discrepancies. They found one. The two sensors on Vela 6911 did not record exactly the same intensity. One sensor saw the flash as slightly brighter than the other. The panel said. If this was a distant sun or nuclear bomb, the light should be equal on both sensors. The difference suggests the source was close to the satellite. Perhaps a small object nearby reflecting sunlight. It was a clever argument. It introduced doubt. It allowed the government to issue a statement saying the event was probably not a nuclear explosion. But the engineers at Los Alamos were furious. They knew something the Ruina panel ignored. Vela 6911 was old. It had been in space for 10 years. Its sensors had degraded unevenly. One lens was simply cloudier than the other due to radiation darkening. The difference in intensity wasn't because of a mysterious paint flake. It was because the machine was aging. When you corrected for the degradation, when you applied the aging factor to the math, the discrepancy vanished. The intensities matched. The zoo event disappeared. The bomb came back. The debate over the physics became a war of attrition. On one side, the politicians and their hand-picked panel, waving the flag of uncertainty. On the other side, the weapon designers and the satellite engineers, clutching their graphs of the double flash. The Naval Research Laboratory joined the engineers. Their hydroacoustic data, the sound of the slap on the water, arrived at the exact time the double flash occurred. Now the coincidence required to believe the official story was even more absurd. You had to believe that a micrometeoroid hit the satellite at the exact same second that a freak underwater earthquake occurred in the Indian Ocean. Nature does not coordinate like that. Nature is random. Conspiracies are coordinated. Flash signature remains the most haunting piece of evidence in the modern nuclear age. It is a signal that was designed to be undeniable. It was designed to prevent cheating. It was designed to ensure that no nation could hide, fire in the dark. But on September 22, 1979, the system worked too well. It detected a truth that the world was not ready to accept. The physics did not lie. The bong meters did not hallucinate. The graph of Vela 6911 is not a drawing of a meteor. It is a drawing of a nightmare. It is the signature of a weapon that officially does not exist, tested by a nation that officially was not there, observed by a satellite that officially saw nothing. As we close the file on the physics of the flash, we are left with the lingering question. If the bomb was real, who built it? And why did the White House go to such lengths to look the other way? To answer that, we must leave the laboratory. We must leave the cold vacuum of space. We must travel to the corridors of power in Pretoria and Jerusalem. We must look at the hidden alliance. The light has faded, but the shadows are just beginning to lengthen. On the lexicon of global security, there are categories for every disaster. There are protocols for a Soviet launch. There are protocols for a Chinese test. There are specific binders, color-coded and kept in safe boxes, that dictate exactly what the President of the United States must do if a known enemy fires a weapon. But on the morning of September 22, 1979, the United States intelligence community faced a scenario for which there was no binder. They faced the terror of the unknown variable. The most dangerous weapon in the world is not the one aimed at you by an enemy. It is the one that explodes in the dark, with no return address. The anomaly detected by Vela 6911 was an orphan. It had no flag. It had no manifesto. It was a violent act of physics committed in a geopolitical void. This file was stamped never open, and the people who opened it wished they hadn't. Yet we begin tonight by walking into the room where the confusion turned into fear. We begin with the silence before the storm. The only sound is the quiet hum of the air conditioning systems deep within the Pentagon. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink is faded with secrets. Imagine the smell of stale coffee and heated electronics. Imagine the feeling of 3 a.m. when the biological clock is desperate for sleep, but the mind is forced into hyper-alertness. We are drifting back to the era of the teletype and the secure line. We are entering the Washington that never sleeps. The signal from Vela 6911 did not go directly to the president. Information in the intelligence world moves like water through a series of locks and dams. It is filtered, analyzed, and verified before it is allowed to rise to the next level. The first people to see the double flash data were the technicians at the Air Force Technical Applications Center AFTAC in Florida. For a few minutes, there was likely a hesitation, a pause where a human being looked at a strip of paper and thought, "This cannot be right." To report a nuclear explosion is to potentially trigger a war. You do not make that call lightly. You check the calibration. You check the timestamp. You look for the signature of a glitch. But the glitch was not there. The data was clean. The double hump was perfect. The realization set in that this was a critic event. A critic message short for critical intelligences, a designation used by the National Security Agency. It is the highest priority handling instruction in the US government. It means, drop everything. It means that this piece of information must reach the president's desk within 10 minutes, no matter where he is, no matter what he is doing. The message began to route through the secure cables. It left Florida. It traveled north. It bypassed the standard filters. It arrived at the National Military Command Center in the Pentagon. It arrived at the CIA headquarters in Langley. It arrived at the White House Situation Room. The time was roughly 8 p.m. Washington time on September 21st, due to the time zone difference with the Indian Ocean. The weekend was beginning. The frantic energy of the work week was winding down, and then the teleprinters began to chatter. The initial report was sparse. It contained coordinates and yield estimates. Lot 47S, long 4OE, yield 2 to 3 knots, confidence high. To a layman, these numbers are abstract. To the duty officers in the Situation Room, they were a geographical impossibility. They looked at the large wall map. They traced the latitude and longitude. Their fingers landed on blue water. If it had been the Soviet Union, the coordinates would have pointed to Syria. If it had been China, Lopner. If it had been France, Mororo Atoll. But this was the middle of the roaring 40s, a patch of ocean notorious for storms and icebergs. Why would anyone test a bomb there? The first theory was a submarine accident. Had a Soviet sub suffered a catastrophic failure? Had a reactor exploded? But the spectral signature was wrong. A reactor meltdown is a messy, slow release of radiation. It doesn't create a double flash. A double flash requires the rapid assembly of critical mass. It requires a warhead. So someone had brought a warhead to the bottom of the world and detonated it. The phone rang at the home of Zbigniew Brzezinski, the national security advisor. Brzezinski was a hawk. He was a man who saw the world as a grand chessboard primarily played against the Soviet Union. Waking him up with news of a nuclear event was like poking a sleeping tiger. He listened to the report. The implications were immediately clear to him. The United States had spent decades building a delicate architecture of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty (NPT) was the Bible of global security. It stated that there were 5 nuclear powers: the US, USSR, UK, France, and China. No one else was allowed in the club. If this flash was real, the club had just been crashed. Someone had broken the lock. Brzezinski called the president. Jimmy Carter was at Camp David, or the White House, seeking respite. Carter was a detail-oriented man. He was not a president who relied solely on summaries. He wanted the raw data. When he was told about the double flash, his reaction was not panic, but a cold, scientific inquiry. He knew what a double flash meant. He knew it was the fingerprint of fission. Who, he asked. And for the first time in a long time, the CIA, the NSA and the Defense Intelligence Agency had to answer with a single, terrifying word: unknown. This unknown was unacceptable. An anonymous nuke is a destabilizing agent. It creates paranoia. If the Soviets thought the Americans did it, they might retaliate. If the Chinese thought the Soviets did it, they might mobilize. The ambiguity was dangerous. The Situation Room went into overdrive. The order went out: find the fallout. This is why the WC-135 planes were scrambled so quickly. The administration needed forensic proof. They needed to catch the particles so they could analyze the isotopic ratio. If they could find the debris, they could tell if the uranium came from a specific mine. They could tell if the plutonium was weapons grade or reactor grade. They could trace the bomb back to its creator. But while the planes were flying, the diplomats were sweating. The timing could not have been worse. To understand the panic in Washington, you have to understand the year. The year 1979, it was, by all accounts, a nightmare year for American foreign policy. The Shah of Iran had fallen. The Sandinistas had taken power in Nicaragua. The Soviet Union was massing troops on the border of Afghanistan. The American embassy in Tehran would soon be seized. The world felt like it was spinning off its axis, and now, a nuclear ghost in the Indian Ocean, that the Carter administration was in the middle of a high-wire act. They were trying to pass the SALT to Treaty strategic arms limitation talks through the Senate. This treaty was designed to cap the number of nuclear weapons the US and USSR could possess. It was the centerpiece of Carter's legacy. It was an attempt to put the nuclear genie back in the bottle. Opponents of the treaty in the Senate were looking for any excuse to kill it. They argued that the Soviets couldn't be trusted. They argued that verification was impossible if news broke that a nuclear explosion had happened, and the US intelligence community didn't know who did it. The argument for the treaty would collapse. If the US couldn't even identify a rogue test, how could they possibly verify what the Soviets were doing in secret silos? The double flash wasn't just a scientific anomaly, it was a political poison pill. Admiral Stansfield Turner, the director of Central Intelligence, began to mobilize his assets. The CIA didn't just look at satellites, they looked at human intelligence. They started asking the question, who has the motive, who has the capability, and who has the friends to help them? The list of suspects was short. Suspect 1, the Soviet Union, probability, low Y. The Soviets had a massive landmass, they didn't need to drag a bomb to the Southern Ocean. It was logistically difficult and strategically pointless. If they wanted to send a message, they would test it where everyone could see it, or where no one could see it. The Prince Edward Islands were too messy. Suspect 2, France. Probability, low to medium. France owned the Kerguelen Islands nearby. They had a history of testing in the Pacific. But France was a recognized nuclear power. They usually issued notice to mariners anno dames to clear the area for safety. They were proud of their arsenal. A secret test in the dark didn't fit their profile. Suspect 3, Pakistan. Probability, rising. Pakistan was known to be pursuing the bomb to counter India, but intelligence suggested they weren't ready yet. Their centrifuges were still spinning up. They lacked the delivery systems for an ocean test. Suspect 4, South Africa. Probability, high. South Africa was the pariah of the world. Under the apartheid regime, they were isolated. They were under a UN arms embargo. They believed they were facing a total onslaught from communist forces in Angola and Mozambique. They needed a deterrent. They needed a gun to put on the table. CIA analysts knew that Pretoria had been working on a nuclear device. 2 years earlier, in 1977, Soviet satellites had spotted a test preparation site in the Kalahari Desert. The Soviets had tipped off the Americans. The US and USSR, in a rare moment of cooperation, had pressured South Africa to shut it down. The South Africans had filled in the holes. But did they stop the program? Or did they just move it? If you can't test in the desert because satellites are watching, where do you go? You go to the one place where the weather is so bad that satellites are blind half the time. You go to the ocean. You go to the islands you own, thousands of miles from the mainland. The logic fit, but there was a missing piece. South Africa had the uranium, they had the motivation, but did they have the technology to miniaturize a warhead and detonate it on a barge or a ship? And more importantly, did they have the technology to measure the results? A nuclear test is a scientific experiment. You need high-speed cameras. You need telemetry. You need to record the data to know if the bomb worked. South Africa was scientifically advanced, but this was next-level engineering. This led the analysts to the final, most sensitive suspect, the silent partner, Suspect 5, Israel. The relationship between Israel and South Africa was one of the world's worst-kept secrets. They were both isolated states. They both had strong militaries. They both felt surrounded by enemies. Israel had the technology. South Africa had the space and the raw materials, uranium. The joint venture theory began to circulate in the closed rooms of the Pentagon. What if Israel provided the design and the instrumentation, and South Africa provided the location and the logistics? This was the nightmare scenario for Jimmy Carter. Israel was a key US ally. The Camp David Accords, signed just a year earlier between Egypt and Israel, were the crowning achievement of Carter's presidency. If he accused Israel of testing a nuclear weapon with the apartheid regime, the peace treaty would shatter. The Arab world would explode. The oil embargoes could return. The intelligence community began to look for the delivery vehicle. A bomb doesn't just appear in the ocean. It has to be carried there. The National Security Agency, NSA, turned its giant ears toward the South Atlantic. They began reviewing the movements of the South African Navy. They looked for gaps in the records. Ships that had left port and then gone silent. They found a task force. In the days leading up to September 22nd, the South African Navy had conducted a sudden exercise in the Southern Ocean. The SAS President Pretorius, a frigate, had been active. More suspiciously, there were reports of a strange vessel at the Simonstown Naval Bassa barge, or a fast attack craft, that didn't fit the usual deployment patterns. But the ocean is vast. Tracking a ship in 1979 without active transponders was like finding a needle in a haystack made of water. The ships maintained radio silence. They moved under the cover of the relentless storms. The CIA also looked at the Israeli Navy. There were rumors of Israeli observers being present in South Africa during that week, but rumors are not proof. In the world of intelligence, you need a smoking gun. And the smoking gun, the radioactive fallout, was still missing. the WC-135. Planes were landing with clean filters. This lack of debris became the lifeline for the politicians. Without the debris, there was plausible deniability. Inside the White House, a split began to form. On one side were the scientists and the mid-level intelligence officers. They trusted the machine. They trusted Vela 6911, they said. The machine saw a bomb. The probability of it being anything else is zero. We must accept this. On the other side were the senior political advisors. They looked at the geopolitical map. They saw the election coming up in 1980. They saw the SALT treaty hanging by a thread. They saw the Middle East peace process. They asked a different question. Not, is it true? But can we afford for it to be true? This is where the archive chill truly sets in. It is the moment when truth becomes inconvenient. The atmosphere in Washington shifted from panic to management. The goal was no longer to identify the culprit. The goal was to manage the narrative. If they couldn't find the fallout, they could claim ambiguity. They could claim it was a natural phenomenon. They could muddy the waters. The director of the Defense Intelligence Agency DIA wrote a memo stating that the flash was unquestionably a nuclear explosion. The Naval Research Laboratory confirmed the hydroacoustic signal. The evidence was piling up, but the White House needed a way out, needed a zoo event. This internal conflict created a surreal atmosphere in the Situation Room. You had the most powerful surveillance apparatus in human history telling the president one thing, and the president's political survival instinct demanding another. The silence of the nations involved was deafening. South Africa issued a denial, but it was a carefully worded one. They didn't say we didn't do it. They said, we have no knowledge of any explosion. Israel said nothing. The Soviet Union, interestingly, stayed relatively quiet initially, perhaps confused by their own lack of data, or perhaps waiting to see how the Americans would handle the embarrassment. The code red was slowly turning into a code gray. Urgency to expose the truth was being replaced by the urgency to bury it. The decision was made to form the Ruina panel. As we touched upon earlier, this was the scientific jury convened by the White House, but from the perspective of the intelligence officers in the trenches, this felt like a betrayal. Imagine being the analyst at AFDAC who has spent his entire career watching for this exact moment. You catch the signal, you verify it, you report it, and then, instead of action, you get a committee. You get a panel of academics who are paid to ask, are you sure it wasn't a reflection of sunlight? It was a form of gaslighting on a governmental scale. The data didn't change, the graph didn't change, but the interpretation was being forced through a political filter. The code red effectively ended not with a bang but with a bureaucratic whimper. The alert status was lowered. The critic messages stopped flying. The midnight phone calls ceased. The event was moved from the urgent action folder to the investigation pending folder, but the fear didn't go away. In fact, for the people who knew the truth, the fear got worse. Because if South Africa and Israel had successfully tested a nuclear weapon and gotten away with it, the rules had changed. The monopoly was over. The code red revealed a terrifying weakness in the global order. It showed that if you were clever enough, if you picked the right spot in the ocean, and if you kept your mouth shut, you could detonate a nuclear bomb and the superpowers would be too paralyzed by their own politics to stop you. The Vela Incident was the ultimate perfect crime. The files from those weeks in Washington are filled with black bars cover the names of informants. Black bars cover the technical details of the satellite sensors, but the emotion in the memos is clear. It is frustration. It is the cold realization that science can detect the truth, but it cannot force people to believe it. The bomb went off. The flash was seen. The sound was heard. And then, Washington decided to sleep. But while Washington slept, the ocean was still churning. The physical location of the event, the Prince Edward Islands, holds its own secrets. To understand why they chose this spot, we must go there. We must travel to the edge of the Antarctic shelf, to the islands of wind and desolation. The file is closed here, but the map is still open. There are places on this earth that were not made for human beings. They are the leftovers of geology, jagged fragments of volcanic rock thrown up from the seabed in the violent spasms of the planet's youth. They sit in the blind spots of our geography, far from the shipping lanes, far from the flight paths, and far from the consciousness of civilization. To find them, you must travel to the bottom of the map, to the latitudes known by sailors as the Roaring Forties and the Furious Fifties. It is here, in the cold, grey wash of the subantarctic Indian Ocean, that we find the coordinates of the anomaly. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight by stepping onto the black basalt shores of the Prince Edward Islands. In the investigation of the Vela Incident, these islands are the smoking gun that never smoked. They are the silent witnesses to the double flash. They are the encrypted landscape where the secret was likely buried. Tonight, we do not look at the sky. We look at the rock. We look at the moss. We look at the most isolated territory on the planet to understand why a government would choose this specific desolation to break the laws of physics. The only sound is the quiet hum of the wind cutting through the tussock grass. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink is faded with secrets. Imagine the smell of sulfur, salt spray, and decaying kelp. Imagine a cold that seeps through the layers of your clothing, a dampness that never truly dries. We are standing on Marion Island, the larger of the two Prince Edward Islands. It is a place of stark, terrifying beauty, a place where the silence is heavy, broken only by the wind and the waves. To the analysts in Washington, looking at their maps in 1979, the Prince Edward Islands were just dots, but to the strategists in Pretoria, they were a geopolitical asset of immense value. These islands belong to South Africa. They are sovereign territory. This means that anything that happens on these rocks, or in the 12 miles of territorial waters surrounding them, is legally the same as if it happened in downtown Johannesburg. But unlike Johannesburg, there are no journalists here. There are no embassies. There are no curious neighbors. The islands are located roughly 1,100 miles southeast of Port Elizabeth. To get there, you must sail for 4 or 5 days through some of the roughest oceans on Earth. The waves here frequently exceed 20 feet. The swells are monstrous, rolling uninterrupted around the globe because there is no landmass to stop them. This isolation is the island's primary defense. It is a fortress built by nature. The history of these islands is a history of forgotten men and secret missions. They were discovered by the Dutch in 1663, but the coordinates were recorded incorrectly, and the islands vanished from the charts for another century. They were lost before they were even truly found. When the French explorer Marc-Joseph Marion Dufresne found them again in 1772, he didn't even bother to land. He saw the sheer cliffs, the crashing surf, and the bleak interior, and he kept sailing. He named the smaller one Isle de la Cavern Cave Island, and the larger one Terra d'Espérance Land of Hope. It was a cruel irony. There is very little hope here for the next 100 years. The only visitors were sealersmen who came to harvest the fur seals that populated the beaches. They lived in caves, surviving on seal meat and despair, often shipwrecked and left for years without rescue. The islands became a graveyard for ships and sanity, but in 1947, the strategic value of this emptiness changed. The world was entering the Cold War. The logic of empire was shifting from conquest to surveillance. South Africa, realizing that foreign powers might try to claim these ownerless rocks to use as missile bases or listening posts, launched a secret operation. It was called Operation Snouttown. On December 29, 1947, a landing party from the HMS AS Transvaal went ashore on Marion Island. They planted the flag. They read a proclamation. They annexed the land for the Union of South Africa. A few days later, they did the same for Prince Edward Island. It was a cold, bureaucratic act performed in a freezing gale. They built a small wooden hut. They left a few men behind to maintain occupation. Why does this matter to the nuclear flash of 1979? Because by annexing these islands, South Africa created a legal black hole. They created a laboratory where they could do anything they wanted, shielded by 1,000 miles of empty ocean and the sovereign right of territory. When the Vela satellite detected the double flash, the triangulation pointed directly to the vicinity of these islands. The epicenter of the explosion was likely in the atmosphere between the islands and the Antarctic shelf, or perhaps mounted on a barge drifting in the lee of the island's volcano. The geography of Marion Island is perfect for hiding a secret. The island is essentially a massive shield volcano rising out of the sea. The highest peak, Mascarin Peak, stands over 1,200 meters tall. The weather is perpetually overcast. On average, Marion Island receives sunshine for only a few hours a day. It rains or snows more than 300 days a year. For a nuclear test, this weather is a double-edged sword. On one hand, the heavy cloud cover is excellent camouflage. It blocks the view of spy satellites. If you detonate a bomb under a thick layer of stratus clouds, the visual flash is muffled. It becomes a diffuse glow rather than a sharp point of light. It scatters. But on the night of September 22, 1979, the weather played a trick. The meteorological records show that there was a rare break in the clouds, a hole in the overcast. It was through this hole that Vela 6911 caught its glimpse. It was a 1 in a million chance. The architects of the test had banked on the weather hiding them, and for a split second, The weather betrayed them. The geology of the Prince Edward Islands tells us another part of the story. These are not stable, quiet lands. They are active. The ground here breathes. Between 1980 and 2004, eruptions occurred on Marion Island. The earth is alive with magma deep beneath the crust. When the Ruina panel in Washington tried to explain away the double flash, they looked at the islands and asked, could it have been a volcano? A volcanic eruption can create lightning. It can create heat. It can create a shockwave. It was a tempting alternative theory. If the flash was just a sudden burst of lava or a gas explosion from a vent, then the diplomatic crisis would evaporate. But the physics didn't fit. A volcanic eruption is a slow, messy release of energy compared to a nuclear bomb. It rumbles. It spews ash. It doesn't create the perfect, nanosecond sharp double hump of light intensity. And more importantly, the hydroacoustic sensors, the listening devices in the ocean, didn't hear an earthquake. They heard an explosion, a sharp singular slap. The islands stood silent, but the ocean around them was busy. In the days following the detection, the area around the Prince Edward Islands became the focus of intense, invisible scrutiny. We must imagine the scene. The ocean is grey and heaving with 20-foot swells. The wind is screaming at 40 knots. And through this chaos, invisible eyes are searching. The United States redirected its surveillance assets. They scanned the waters for the heat signatures of ships. They looked for the telltale wake of a naval task force. The South African Navy had a facility on the mainland at This was a sophisticated maritime tracking center built inside a mountain, capable of monitoring shipping traffic around the Cape of Good Hope. It was one of the most advanced listening posts in the Southern Hemisphere. If a fleet had moved towards Marion Island, Silvermean would have known. But Silvermean was South African. The Fox was guarding the henhouse. The Americans had to rely on their own data, and the data showed gaps. There were reports of a South African oceanographic research vessel, the SA Agulhas, operating in the area. These distinct red-painted ships are designed to break ice and supply the weather stations on the islands. They are civilian ships on paper, but in a time of war, a time of secret testing, any hull can carry a weapon. Did the Agulhas carry the device? Or was it a fast attack craft, a Resh-F-class missile boat purchased from Israel? The Resh boats were small, fast, and hard to track. They had the range to get there if they refueled. The theory goes like this. The device was loaded onto a ship in Simonstown. The ship sailed south, running dark, no lights, no radio. They rendezvoused at the Prince Edward Islands. They waited for the weather to turn bad, for the cloud cover to thicken. They suspended the device from a balloon, or perhaps placed it on a barge. Why a balloon? Because a nuclear test in the ocean creates a massive crater if it's on the surface. It creates a tsunami. But if you detonate it in the air, a few thousand feet up, the blast wave slaps the water but doesn't displace it. It minimizes the physical evidence. It hides the crater. This is consistent with the clean nature of the Vela Incident. No crater was ever found. No massive wave was recorded hitting the shores of Australia. It was an airburst, a phantom explosion suspended between the heavy clouds and the black water. The search for debris on the islands themselves was a logistical nightmare. Marion Island is difficult to traverse. It is a bog. The ground is soft, spongy, waterlogged, volcanic ash covered in moss and Azarella salego plants. You cannot drive vehicles there. You have to walk, and walking is exhausting. If fallout had drifted over the island, it would have been trapped in the moss. The lichen on the rocks acts like a sponge for radioactive isotopes. It absorbs everything from the air and holds it for centuries. South African scientists were on the island at the time. There was a meteorological station there, manned by a small team. Did they know? This is one of the most chilling aspects of the mystery. There were men on that rock, civilians, weather watchers, biologists studying the seals. On the night of September 22nd, did they see the flash? Did they feel the ground shake? Or were they told to stay inside? Were they evacuated? Or perhaps were they simply asleep, unaware that the sky above them was being torn apart by the power of the sun? There are rumors that the station personnel were replaced shortly after the event. Rumors of non-disclosure agreements signed in windowless rooms in Pretoria. But these are just rumors. The logbooks of the Marion Island station for that week are mundane. They record wind speed. They record barometric pressure. They record the temperature. They do not record a sunrise at 1 a.m. The wildlife of the Prince Edward Islands offers another layer of silence. These islands are home to massive colonies of king penguins, macaroni penguins, and elephant seals. They are biologically rich. If a dirty bomb had exploded nearby, the radiation would have entered the food chain immediately. It would have settled on the algae. The krill would have eaten the algae. The fish would have eaten the krill. The seals and penguins would have eaten the fish. In the years following 1979, scientists have looked at the bones of these animals. They have tested the sediment in the island's lakes. They were looking for cesium-137. They were looking for the chemical fingerprint of the bomb. The results were ambiguous. Some studies found slightly elevated levels of radiation in the soil, but was it from the Vela incident? Or was it the lingering global fallout from the thousands of tests conducted by the US and USSR in the 1950s and 60s? The southern hemisphere is generally cleaner than the northern hemisphere when it comes to fallout, so any spike stands out. But there was no smoking penguin, there was no mass die-off. This supports the theory that the bomb was small and the wind was strong. The winds in the roaring 40s blow from west to east. They are relentless. A radioactive plume released at Prince Edward Island would have been stripped away instantly. It would have been carried east, towards Australia, thinning out with every mile until it was undetectable. This is the genius of the location. The atmosphere itself is a disposal system. It is a washing machine that scrubs the air clean. By the time the American sniffer planes arrived, days later, the air they sampled had traveled thousands of miles. The particles were gone. The isolation of the Prince Edward Islands is not just physical, it is informational. In 1979, there was no internet. There were no commercial satellites taking photos of every square inch of the Earth. If you were there, you were alone. The search for the truth of the Vela incident is effectively a search for a needle in a haystack, where the haystack is the size of a continent and the needle has been dissolved by the wind. But the file remains open because of the anomalies that won't go away. The hydroacoustic data, the bong meter data, and the sheep. We must briefly return to the sheep. In the weeks following the flash, trace amounts of iodine-131 were found in the thyroids of sheep in Victoria and Tasmania, Australia. Iodine-131 is a short-lived isotope. It decays quickly. If you find it, it means a nuclear event happened recently. The wind patterns from the Prince Edward Islands blow directly towards southern Australia. The timing fit, the chemistry fit. The Australian scientists were baffled. They hadn't tested a bomb. The French in the Pacific were too far away for the wind to carry it there that quickly. The only upwind source was the empty ocean. The only suspect was the storm-battered rock of Marion Island. And yet, the political pressure suppressed this evidence too. It was dismissed as laboratory error. It was dismissed as contaminated reagents. The Prince Edward Islands kept their secret. The moss continued to grow. The rain continued to fall. The evidence was washed into the sea. Today, Marion Island is still a research station. South Africa maintains a presence there. It is a place for biology, for meteorology, for studying climate change. The scientists who go there today are not spies. They are academics. They walk the same paths that the secret agents might have walked in 1979. They look at the same grey horizon. But the legacy of the event remains. The Vela incident is the ghost that haunts the station. It is the campfire story told on stormy nights. Every few years a new document is declassified, a new memoir is written. A former spy speaks out, and every time, the finger points back to these coordinates. Dieter Gerhardt, a Soviet spy who rose to the rank of Commodore in the South African Navy, claimed later that the test was real. He claimed it was a joint Israeli-South African operation. He called it Operation Phoenix. He said the ships were there. He said the flash was real. But official confirmation never comes. The South African government, post-apartheid, dismantled its nuclear program. They admitted to building 6 bombs. They admitted to having the capability. But they never admitted to the test. They claimed they never pulled the trigger. So, was the 7th bomb tested at Prince Edward Island? Or was it an Israeli weapon tested with South African help? The ocean isn't talking. The Prince Edward Islands sit in the darkness of the Southern Ocean, indifferent to our questions. They are a reminder that the world is big enough to hide a sun. They are a reminder that if you go far enough south, past the shipping lanes, past the flight paths, you enter a zone where the rules of civilization fade away, and only the laws of physics remain. The file was stamped, never open, and looking at the desolate beauty of these islands, we can see why. It is a place that resists answers. It absorbs them, it freezes them. We leave the islands now. We leave the wind and the penguins and the black rock. We must follow the trail of the silence. We must look at the diplomatic channels that went dead. We must look at the 2 nations that stood in the shadows while the world asked who. We travel north, to the corridors of power that connected Pretoria and Jerusalem. The flash lasted for a second. The silence has lasted for 45 years. Silence is usually defined as the absence of sound. But in the world of international espionage, silence is an active frequency. It is a signal. It is a decision. When a nuclear weapon detonates in the middle of the ocean, the physics of the event is loud. The flash screams across the electromagnetic spectrum. The shockwave bellows through the water. But the loudest thing that happened on September 22, 1979, was not the explosion itself. It was the lack of a phone call. It was the diplomatic void that opened up between the capitals of the world. The file was stamped "Never open," yet we begin tonight by listening to the quiet. We are not looking for what was said. We are looking for what was withheld. We are analyzing the strategic darkness that fell over Moscow and Pretoria and the Pretoria. Hours after the double flash, the global intelligence network waited for a confession. They waited for an accusation. Instead, they got a vacuum. This is the story of how two nations, enemies on the surface, found themselves united by a secret that neither could afford to speak. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets. Imagine the chill of a Moscow autumn. Imagine the smell of damp wool and ozone in a listening post deep within the Kremlin. We are drifting back to the height of the Cold War, but the temperature is dropping even further. We are entering the silent rooms where the map of the world was being redrawn in invisible ink. When the Vela satellite sent its alert to Washington, the Americans assumed the Soviets would be the first to scream. The Soviet Union watched the world with a paranoia that rivaled the United States. They had their own satellites. They had their own hydroacoustic networks. If an American bomb had gone off in the Indian Ocean, Moscow would have normally used it as a propaganda weapon. They would have gone to the United Nations. They would have accused the imperialist West of reckless aggression. But on that morning, the Soviet news agency was silent. The Kremlin hotlines were cold. Why? To understand this, we must look at what the Soviets actually knew. It is highly probable that their own satellites missed the flash. The Soviet ecosystem was designed to watch the missile fields of North Dakota, not the empty waves of the South Atlantic. They were looking north, not south, but their ships were there. The Soviet Navy had a significant presence in the Indian Ocean. They used it to monitor U.S. naval movements and to support their client states in Africa. If a bomb went off, their hydrophones heard it. Their submarines felt it. So, why the silence? The silence from Moscow was likely a mixture of confusion and opportunism. If they didn't see the flash, but heard the sound, they might have been unsure. Was it a natural event? Was it a secret American test? If it was an American test, staying silent gave the Soviets leverage. It meant they knew a secret that the Americans were trying to hide. In the game of 4D chess that was the Cold War, sometimes you don't flip the board over. Sometimes you just stare at your opponent and let them sweat. There is a darker theory. The Soviets knew exactly who did it. They knew it was South Africa. And they knew that exposing it would complicate their own wars in Angola and Mozambique. If South Africa had the bomb, the calculus of the Bush War changed instantly. To announce it to the world might cause panic among their African allies. It might force the Soviets to escalate, to send nuclear weapons to Angola to balance the scales. And Brezhnev, old and tired, did not want a nuclear crisis in Africa. So Moscow went dark. They watched. They waited. If Moscow's silence was tactical, Pretoria's silence was existential. South Africa in 1979 was a fortress state. The Prime Minister, P.W. Botha, was known as Die Groot Crocodile, the Great Crocodile. He was a man who believed in total strategy. He believed that the white minority government was facing a total onslaught from communism and black nationalism, that the nuclear program was his ultimate insurance policy. It was the Samson option. If the country was about to be overrun, they would threaten to pull the pillars down. But a deterrent only works if people know you have it. This is the paradox of the Vela Incident. Why test a bomb in secret? Why not announce it? Why not invite the world to watch, like the Americans did at Bikini 8? Because South Africa wanted the capability without the consequences if they announced the test. The sanctions would be immediate and crushing. The West, even their quiet friends in Washington and London, would be forced to cut them off completely. The economy would collapse. The oil would stop flowing. So they needed a deniable deterrent. They needed the world to suspect they had the bomb, but not be able to prove it. They wanted the rumors to do the work. They wanted the intelligence agencies to whisper, "Don't push Pretoria too far. They might have the weapon." The silence was the message. By not admitting it, and not denying it too loudly, they created a zone of ambiguity. when the US State Department finally called Pretoria to ask about the flash. The response was a masterpiece of diplomatic evasion. The foreign minister didn't say no. He said, "We have no knowledge of such an event." No knowledge. It is a phrase that legally protects you while morally indicting you. It means I didn't see it. It doesn't mean I didn't order it. Behind the scenes, the South African government went into cleanup mode. The scientists at the Palindaba nuclear facility were likely told to scrub their labs. The naval logs of the Simonstown base were likely edited. The sailors who were on the ships near Prince Edward Island were likely debriefed and threatened with treason charges if they spoke. The silence was enforced. It was a silent sport with fear, but there was a third player in this silent game, a player who said even less than the others. Israel. The silence of Israel is perhaps the most complex of all. Israel's policy regarding nuclear weapons is known as it is a policy of deliberate ambiguity. Israel will not be the first country to introduce nuclear weapons to the Middle East. This is the standard line. It is a line that has been repeated for decades. But in 1979, the intelligence community believed that Israel was not just a nuclear power, but a sophisticated one. They needed to test their designs. But Israel is a small country. You cannot detonate a nuclear weapon in the Negev desert without breaking windows in Tel Aviv and Cairo. You cannot hide the seismic signal. The theory goes, they needed a partner with space. A partner with a big, empty ocean. If the Vela Incident was a joint operation, Israel's silence was mandatory. They could not admit to testing a weapon with the apartheid regime. The diplomatic fallout would be catastrophic. It would destroy their relationship with the United States. It would alienate them from the few African nations they still had ties with. So, Jerusalem went dark. But silence is not empty. Silence is filled with behavior. In the weeks after the flash, investigative journalists and intelligence analysts began to look at the flight logs. They looked at the movement of cargo planes between Tel Aviv and South Africa. They looked at the visits of high-ranking officials. There was a pattern. Defense Minister Ezer Weizman had visited South Africa secretly. There were reports of Israeli scientists living in luxury housing near the Palindaba facility. There was a flow of technology going south, and a flow of yellowcake uranium going north. The silence covered a highway of exchange. The U.S. intelligence community saw this. The CIA knew about the alliance, but they, too, became part of the conspiracy of silence. Why? Because exposing Israel would have forced President Carter to sanction his greatest ally in the Middle East. It would have collapsed the Camp David Accords. It would have handed a victory to the Soviet Union. So, the Americans joined the silence. They became the fourth partner in the dance. This is the archive chill at its deepest level. It is the realization that the truth was not lost. It was buried by a committee of nations. Everyone had a reason to look away. Everyone had a reason to let the flash fade into history without a name. The silence created a vacuum that was filled with speculation. And where there is speculation, there is paranoia. In the absence of an official story, the unofficial stories began to grow. The rumor mill in the diplomatic cocktail parties of Vienna and Geneva began to spin. Did you hear about the neutron bomb? Did you hear it was a tactical trigger? Did you hear the Chinese were involved? The silence didn't stop the story. It just made the story uncontrollable. It turned a scientific event into a myth. Let's go back to Moscow for a moment. The Soviet silence eventually cracked, but only slightly. Years later, after the Cold War ended, Russian scientists began to talk. They confirmed that their hydroacoustic sensors did detect the explosion. They confirmed that they knew it was a bomb. So why didn't they speak in 1979? Because they were playing a longer game. They knew that by keeping the secret they held a card they could play later. If they ever needed to pressure South Africa or embarrass the Americans, they could pull the file out of the safe. Knowledge is power, but secret knowledge is absolute power. They let the Americans squirm. They watched the Carter administration twist itself into knots trying to explain away the double flash. For the Kremlin, watching the Americans lie to their own people was more valuable than exposing the truth. It was a victory of cynicism. The silence of Pretoria was different. It was the silence of a guilty man holding a smoking gun. But it was also a silence of pride. In the Afrikaner nationalist mindset, the bomb was a triumph of ingenuity. They had built it alone, or mostly alone, under sanctions, with the world against them. They couldn't brag about it publicly. But in the closed boardrooms of the Broederbond, the secret society that ran South Africa, there must have been toasts raised to the flash in the South. They had joined the club. They had become untouchable, or so they thought. The tragedy of this silence is what it did to the scientists. The men and women who built the device, physicists, chemists, engineers, were denied their moment of recognition. In science, you publish, you share, you stand on the podium. But these scientists were ghosts. Their work was classified. Their success was a state secret. They had to go home to their families and say nothing. They had to live with the knowledge that they had broken the atom, and the world pretended it didn't happen. The silence extended beyond the governments. It extended to the media. In South Africa, the press was heavily censored. The Defense Act prohibited reporting on military matters without permission. If a journalist in Johannesburg had heard rumors of the test, they couldn't print it. They would have been jailed. So the South African public remained in the dark. They went to work. They went to the beach. They lived their lives, unaware that their government had just detonated a nuclear weapon in their name. In the US. The media was free, but they were starved of oxygen. Without official confirmation, the story died. A mystery is only interesting for a few news cycles. If there is no follow-up, no press conference, no debris, the editors move on. The story was suffocated by a lack of oxygen, but there were cracks in the wall, small leaks. A CBS News reporter, Dan Rather, broke the story initially. He reported that the US had detected a nuclear explosion, but even he couldn't get a confirmation on the culprit. The who remained elusive. The silence of nations is not just about keeping a secret, it's about controlling the timeline. By staying silent, South Africa and Israel bought themselves time to hide the evidence, time to dismantle the testing rig, time to paint the ships, time to scatter the witnesses. Every day that passed without an admission was a victory for the cover-up. The trail got colder, the isotopes decayed, the memories faded. And what are the United Nations, the global body designed to prevent this exact thing? The UN passed resolutions. They condemned nuclear collaboration with South Africa. They launched an inquiry, but without the cooperation of the superpowers, the UN is toothless. The investigators couldn't go to the Prince Edward Islands. They couldn't inspect the Israeli facilities. They could only write reports based on public data. The UN report on the Vela Incident is a document of frustration. It concludes that the data is consistent with a nuclear explosion, but it cannot definitively assign blame. It is a scream into the void. This brings us back to the concept of the archive chill. The chill comes from the realization that the systems we trust to protect us, the treaties, the alliances, the international laws, are fragile. They are based on the assumption that nations will follow the rules, or at least admit when they break them. But when nations go dark, the system fails. The Vela Incident proved that you can beat the system. You can test a bomb and get away with it. You just have to be willing to endure the silence. There is a psychological toll to this silence. For the leaders involved, Carter, Brezhnev, Botha, the secret became a burden. It was a file that had to be passed to the next administration, and the next. Here is the folder on the flash. Don't open it. It became a zombie secret, not quite alive, not quite dead, just there, lurking in the archives. Decades later, the silence began to erode, not from the top down, but from the bottom up. After the fall of apartheid in 1994, South Africa did something unprecedented. It became the first nation in history to voluntarily dismantle its nuclear arsenal. It opened the doors of Pelindaba to the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAE. Inspectors walked in. They saw the highly enriched uranium. They saw the bomb casings. They confirmed that South Africa had built 6 devices, but they never found the smoking gun for the Vela Incident. The records for that specific test were missing, or they were never written down. F.W. de Klerk, the president who ended apartheid and the nuclear program, admitted to the bombs but denied the test. "We never tested," he said. "We didn't need to. We knew the design would work." Was he lying? Or was he kept in the dark too? Was the Vela test a rogue operation by the military, kept secret even from the civilian leadership? The silence of 1979 protected the guilty, but it also protected the peace. If the truth had come out then, the Cold War might have turned hot. The Middle East might have exploded. So, in a strange, twisted way, the silence saved the world. It was a lie that kept the balance. But for us, looking back, the silence is haunting. It reminds us that history is not just what is written in the books, it is what is left out. It is the blank spaces between the paragraphs. The silence of nations is the ultimate cold case. The suspects are all dead. The governments have changed. The ships have been scrapped. But the signal remains. We leave the capitals now. We leave the dark windows of the Kremlin and the Union buildings. The political cover-up was successful, but there was another layer to this mystery. A layer that involved secret handshakes, covert shipments, and a project with a codename that sounds like a conspiracy thriller, we must look at the Hidden Alliance. We must look at Project Circle. The governments were silent, but the spies were busy. In the shadow world of international relations, there are treaties signed with golden pens under the bright lights of television cameras. These are the agreements that history books record, but there is another layer of diplomacy, a layer that exists in unlisted hangars, in desert safe houses, and in the encrypted cables that run beneath the ocean floor. This is where the real alliances are forged, not out of friendship, but out of necessity, out of survival, out of the mutual understanding that if one falls, the other might follow. On September 22, 1979, the flash in the Indian Ocean illuminated more than just the water. It illuminated a ghost bridge connecting two of the most isolated nations on Earth. One was fighting for its life in the Middle East. The other was fighting for its soul at the bottom of Africa. The file was stamped never open. Yet we begin tonight by tracing the invisible lines of Project Circle. We are going to look at the classified exchange of diamonds for detonators, of uranium for guidance systems. We are going to uncover the hidden handshake that likely built the bomb that no one wants to claim. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets. Imagine the dry heat of the Negev desert, mixing with the humid winds of the Cape. Imagine the smell of jet fuel on a tarmac at midnight. We are drifting into the secret history of the 1970s. The world outside is loud with disco and politics, but in here, the atmosphere is hushed. We are entering the vault of the unholy alliance. To understand why a nuclear flash appeared in the freezing waters of the Prince Edward Islands, we must first understand the desperation of the men who put it there. By the mid-1970s, South Africa and Israel were the pariahs of the international community. South Africa, under the apartheid regime, was facing a world that was slowly closing its doors. The United Nations had imposed a mandatory arms embargo in 1977. The United States and Europe were pulling back. The Soviet Union was funding insurgencies on their borders. Pretoria felt alone in a hostile continent. They needed weapons. They needed technology. And most of all, they needed a deterrent that would make their enemies think twice before crossing the Limpopo River. Israel, while not a pariah in the same sense, was surrounded by hostile neighbors. After the 1973 Yom Kippur War, they realized that conventional superiority wasn't enough. They needed absolute security. They needed the Samson option, the nuclear ability to bring down the temple if they were overrun. But Israel is a tiny strip of land. They had the brains, they had the scientists, but they had no strategic depth. They had nowhere to test a weapon without alerting and terrifying the entire Middle East. It was a perfect match of needs. South Africa had the raw materials. They sat on some of the largest uranium reserves in the world. They had vast, empty spaces. They had money. Israel had the technology. They had the advanced electronics. They had the missile designs. They had the miniaturization capability that South Africa lacked. And so, the relationship began. It wasn't written down in public treaties. It was built on personal relationships between generals and defense ministers. It was built on visits that never appeared in the official logs. The rumors began to circulate in intelligence circles as early as 1975. The CIA station chief in Pretoria noticed more Hebrew being spoken in the hallways of the South African Defense Ministry. He noticed that South African generals were taking frequent holidays to Tel Aviv. Then came the hardware. The South African Air Force began to fly planes that looked suspiciously like the French Mirage jets that Israel had modified. They called them cheetahs, but the avionics inside were Israeli. The South African Navy bought Minister-class strike craft. These were identical to the Israeli Resh-class boats. If they were sharing planes and boats, what else were they sharing? The answer lay in the desert. In 1976, South African Prime Minister B.J. Vorster visited Jerusalem. He was given a tour of Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial. This was a surreal moment. A leader who had been interned during World War II for anti-British and pro-German sympathies, now laying a wreath for the victims of the Holocaust. But geopolitics has no memory. It only has interests. During this visit, a secret agreement was signed. It was known as the Agreement on Science and Technology. It sounds innocent. It sounds like a student exchange program. But science and technology, in the language of 1970s defense ministries, meant one thing: nuclear physics. The CIA later obtained evidence of a specific trade. South Africa would provide 500 tons of yellowcake uranium to Israel. This was the fuel Israel needed for its Dimona reactor to produce plutonium. In exchange, Israel would provide South Africa with 30 grams of tritium. Visual note, a glass vial glowing faintly green. Text overlay, tritium H3. The camera rotates around the vial. Tritium is not used for power plants. It is not used for medicine. Tritium is a booster gas. It is used to turn a simple atomic bomb into a boosted fission weapon. It increases the yield. It makes the explosion bigger, hotter, and more efficient. It allows you to make the warhead smaller so it can fit on a missile. When you see a shipment of tritium, you are seeing a shipment of intent. This trade was the foundation of Project Circle. It was the code name that supposedly covered the nuclear cooperation. The circle was closed. Uranium went north. Technology went south. And the world was none the wiser. But building a bomb is one thing. Testing it is another. The logistical challenge of a joint nuclear test is immense. You cannot simply FedEx a nuclear device. It requires a chain of custody that is unbreakable. It requires secrecy that is absolute. If the Vela Incident was indeed the fruit of this hidden alliance, the operation likely began months before the flash. We must imagine the movement of the components. The fissile material, the core, was likely cast in South Africa, at the Pelindaba facility, using the uranium they had enriched. But the trigger mechanism, the electronics, the brain of the bomb, likely came from the north. There are reports of Israeli C-130 Hercules transport planes making long-haul flights to South Africa in the late 70s. These flights often filed flight plans for agricultural equipment or machinery, but they landed at military airbases like Waterkloof. They were met by armored trucks. The rumor that persists to this day is that the weapon tested on September 22, 1979, was an Israeli artillery shell, a tactical nuclear weapon designed to be fired from a cannon or dropped by a small aircraft. It was a low-yield device, perfectly matching the 2 to 3 kiloton signature picked up by the satellite. Why would Israel need to test a small bomb? Because miniaturization is hard. Making a big bomb is relatively easy, you just smash enough uranium together. But making a small bomb that fits inside a 155mm shell requires precise engineering. You need to be sure the implosion is perfect. You need a test. South Africa, on the other hand, wanted to test their delivery systems. They were building a missile called the RSA-3. It was basically a clone of the Israeli Jericho missile. To test the missile, you need a dummy warhead. But eventually, you want to know if the real warhead works, so the interests converged at the bottom of the world. The Project Circle rumors suggest that a team of Israeli observers was present on the ships during the test. They weren't there to turn the key. They were there to hold the clipboards. They were there to verify the data. This adds a layer of human tension to the story. Imagine being an Israeli scientist, standing on the deck of a South African frigate in the freezing Indian Ocean. You are thousands of miles from home. You are working with a regime that the rest of the world despises. You are watching the sky for a flash that will confirm years of work. And you know that if anything goes wrong, if the wind shifts, if the ship sinks, if the Americans see, you will never be acknowledged. Your government will deny you existed. This is the cold reality of the deniable asset. The alliance was not just about bombs. It was about survival psychology. Both nations felt they were the last outposts of their respective civilizations. They developed a lager mentality. In South African history, a lager was a circle of wagons drawn up to defend against attack. Israel and South Africa formed a global lager, 2 wagons, back to back, fighting off the world. But secrets have a way of leaving physical traces. In the years following the Vela Incident, investigators found anomalies in the trade data. Israel was importing vast amounts of South African coal. South Africa was importing Israeli electronics at a rate that exceeded civilian demand. The two economies were interlocking. And then there was the Kalahari incident of 1977. 2 years before the ocean flash, Soviet satellites spotted a test preparation site in the Kalahari Desert. They saw a deep shaft drilled into the ground. They saw an instrumentation tower. The world pressured South Africa to shut it down. They did, but the hole was already dug. The preparations were made. When the pressure became too great to test on land, the operation simply moved. It moved from the hot sand of the Kalahari to the cold water of the Prince Edward Islands. The logic remains consistent. The alliance didn't stop. It just relocated. The hidden alliance also explains the silence we discussed earlier. If this was a solo South African effort, Israel would have had no reason to stay quiet. They could have alerted the US. They could have gained favor with Carter, but they didn't. Their silence is the strongest evidence of their complicity. And what of the Americans? Did they know about the alliance? The CIA is not blind. They have assets in Tel Aviv. They have assets in Pretoria. They watched the flow of money and men. There is a strong belief among historians that the CIA did know. They knew Project Circle existed. They knew the test was coming. But they were paralyzed by the double ally problem. They couldn't burn Israel without destroying their Middle East strategy. They couldn't burn South Africa without risking the supply of strategic minerals, chrome, platinum, that the US needed for its own military. So, the Americans watched the alliance from the shadows. They let it happen. And when the flash went off, they feigned surprise. The relationship between the two nations went deeper than just hardware. It extended into the philosophy of war. South African generals admired the Israeli military. They studied the Six-Day War. They admired the preventative strike doctrine, the idea that you hit your enemy before they hit you. This influenced South Africa's aggressive raids into Angola. In return, Israel found in South Africa a testing ground. The wars in Southern Africa were real. They were not simulations. Israeli weapons sold to South Africa were used in combat against Soviet-backed Cuban forces in Angola. This provided valuable field data. Did the Galil rifle work in the dust of the Bushveld? Did the Gabriel missile work in the rough seas of the Cape? South Africa became a laboratory for Israeli defense contractors, and the ultimate experiment in this laboratory was the nuclear test. But let us return to the rumors. In the world of intelligence, a rumor is often a truth that lacks a signature. One persistent rumor involves a specific individual. Commodore Dieter, we mentioned him briefly before. He was the commander of the Simonstown Naval Base. He was a man with top-secret clearance. He was also a spy for the Soviet Union. For years Gerhardt lived a double life. He sat in the planning meetings during the day, and photographed documents for the KGB at night. He was arrested in 1983. In his interrogation, and in interviews after his release, Gerhardt was blunt. He said there was no mystery. He said the Vela Incident was an Israeli-South African joint test. He called it Operation Phoenix. He claimed the weather was bad, so they thought they were safe from satellites. He claimed that the flash was picked up because of a break in the clouds. The hole in the overcast that we discussed. Gerhardt's testimony is compelling because he had no reason to lie to the Soviets. His job was to tell them the truth, and the Soviets accepted his report. Another rumor involves the Jericho missiles. The Jericho program was Israel's ballistic missile project. It is widely believed that the South African RSA series of rockets were direct copies of the Jericho. The stages were the same. The fuel was the same. The dimensions were the same. You do not copy a rocket by accident. You copy it because someone gave you the blueprints. This transfer of technology suggests a level of trust that is rare between nations. It suggests that for a brief moment in history, Pretoria and Jerusalem were operating as a single strategic entity. They shared a nervous system. But all alliances have an expiration date. As the 1980s progressed, the pressure on South Africa mounted. The anti-apartheid movement grew. The sanctions bit harder. And in Israel, the political landscape shifted. The US began to pressure Israel to cut ties with the apartheid regime. The Project Circle began to close. But the legacy of the alliance remained buried in the vaults. The 30 grams of tritium, the blueprints, the test data from the Prince Edward Islands, these things didn't vanish. They were likely destroyed, shredder by shredder, burn bag by burn bag, as the apartheid government prepared to hand over power in the early 90s. When Nelson Mandela became president, he inherited a country that had been a nuclear power, but the archives were empty. The scientists remained silent. The hidden alliance had successfully erased its footprints. The only thing they couldn't erase was the flash. The satellite saw it, the physics recorded it, and that single data point serves as the anchor for all these rumors. Without the flash, Project Circle would just be a conspiracy theory. With the flash, it becomes the most plausible explanation for an impossible event. The exchange was not just strategic, it was transactional. Rumors have long persisted about the diamonds for nuclear tech trade. South Africa produces some of the world's finest diamonds. Israel is one of the world's centers for diamond cutting and trading. It was a natural currency. Untold millions in uncut stones may have flown north on those same cargo planes, paying for the guidance systems and the tritium. It creates a chilling image. The ultimate weapon of mass destruction, paid for with the ultimate symbol of vanity. A bright flash purchased with a sparkling stone. The hidden alliance teaches us a lesson about the nature of power. When survival is at stake, ideology fades. Moral objections vanish. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, and if my friend has a bomb, I want one too. The rumors of Project Circle are likely to remain rumors. The official files in Israel are sealed for decades, perhaps centuries. The files in South Africa were largely destroyed. The participants are aging and dying, but the silence speaks. The lack of denial speaks. The coincidences speak. We are left with a picture of a world where the official map is a lie, where the real borders are defined by secret handshakes and shared secrets. The alliance is gone now. South Africa is a democracy. Israel has moved on to other strategic partners. The Prince Edward Islands are just a bird sanctuary again. But for one night in 1979, the connection was live. The circuit was closed, and the energy that flowed through it was bright enough to be seen from space. The file was stamped never open, and perhaps that is because it contains the names of friends who should never have met. We have looked at the physics. We have looked at the politics. We have looked at the spies. But there is one more witness we haven't cross-examined, a witness that cannot be bribed, and cannot be shredded. We must look at the biological evidence. We must return to the sheep in Australia, the thyroids that held the poison. The most sophisticated surveillance network in human history was built of steel, silicon, and copper. It orbited in the vacuum of space. It listened from the bottom of the ocean. It processed data in the windowless bunkers of Washington and Moscow. But on the morning of September 22, 1979, the most important witness to the crime was not a machine. It was not a satellite. It was biology. The evidence of the nuclear flash was not just recorded on magnetic tape. It was absorbed into the living tissue of the planet. It fell from the sky in rain. It landed on the green hills of the southern hemisphere, and it was consumed by the most innocent of observers, while the politicians in the White House debated the reliability of the double flash sensor. And while the spies in Pretoria burned their documents, the truth was being written in the thyroid glands of livestock thousands of miles away. This file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight by stepping into the wet, cold pastures of Tasmania and Victoria. We are going to examine the anomaly that could not be erased because it was alive. We are going to look at the hidden truth found inside the flock. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets. Imagine the smell of formaldehyde and damp wool. Imagine the clinical, sterile atmosphere of a pathology lab in late 1979. We are drifting away from the high-stakes diplomacy of the Situation Room and entering the quiet, methodical world of veterinary science. Here, there are no politics. There is only chemistry. To understand how a sheep in Australia can solve a mystery in the Indian Ocean, we must understand the mechanism of fallout. When a nuclear weapon detonates, it pulverizes the material of the bomb, the uranium or plutonium, and splits the atoms. This creates a cocktail of new elements, known as fission products. These are unstable radioactive isotopes that did not exist a moment before. These particles are microscopic. They are lighter than dust. They are injected into the atmosphere, carried upward by the heat of the fireball. If the bomb is detonated in the air, as the Vela Incident likely was, the cloud does not stay put. It enters the slipstream of the planet. It enters the weather. The winds in the southern hemisphere are known as the westerlies. They are a relentless conveyor belt of air that circles Antarctica, moving from west to east, unimpeded by land. If you release a plume of smoke at the Prince Edward Islands, the wind will carry it directly toward the southern coast of Australia. It is a journey of thousands of miles, but the wind is fast. In late September 1979, the conveyor belt was running. The air mass that was over the Prince Edward Islands on the night of the flash arrived over the Australian states of Victoria and Tasmania a few days later, and with it came the rain. Rain is the great scavenger of the atmosphere. As raindrops fall, they scrub the air. They grab onto dust, pollen, and radioactive particles, dragging them down to the earth. This process is called rain. The rain fell on the pastures. The water evaporated, but the particles remained. They clung to the grass. They coated the clover, and then the sheep began to graze. A sheep is, functionally, a biological vacuum cleaner. It spends its entire day eating grass. It processes huge volumes of plant matter. If there is a trace amount of a substance on the grass too small to be detected by a handheld Geiger counter, the sheep will concentrate it. It gathers the scattered evidence and stores it in its body. Specifically, the body stores iodine. Iodine 131 is a specific isotope created by nuclear fission. It does not occur naturally in any significant quantity. If you find iodine 131, you have found a nuclear event. The thyroid gland, located in the neck, requires iodine to function. It pulls iodine from the bloodstream and locks it away. So, the sheep ate the grass. The digestion extracted the iodine. The blood carried it to the thyroid. And there, inside the gland, the evidence of the bomb was trapped. The sheep became a living black box recorder. This is where the archive chill meets the scientific method. The evidence was not hidden in a safe. It was walking around in the paddocks of Australian farmers. It was hiding in plain sight, but for the evidence to be found, someone had to look, and they weren't looking for a bomb. They were looking for something else entirely. It was a coincidence of science that brought the secret to light. In 1979, the Australian Radiation Laboratory (ARL) was conducting a routine monitoring program. They weren't hunting for secret South African nukes. They were monitoring the food supply for safety. It was a mundane bureaucratic task. Every month they would collect samples of milk and animal thyroids to establish a baseline for background radiation. The scientists doing this work were creatures of habit. They knew what the numbers should look like. The southern hemisphere is generally very clean, unlike the northern hemisphere, which was dusted with fallout from American, Soviet, and Chinese tests. The air down south was pristine. The background radiation levels should be near 0. But in October 1979, the numbers jumped. A scientist named Dr. Rob Robotham was analyzing the samples. He placed the thyroid tissue into the gamma. This machine measures the energy of the gamma rays coming off an object. Each radioactive element sings a different note. Cesium sings at one frequency, strontium at another. Iodine-131 sings at 364 kiloelectronvolts kV. Closing parenthesis. Dr. Robotham saw the spike at 364 kV. It was small, but it was undeniable. It was a fingerprint. He checked the date of the sample. The sheep had been slaughtered in Melbourne shortly after the date of the Vela flash. He checked samples from Tasmania. They showed the spike to. The presence of iodine-131 is a ticking clock. It has a half-life of only 8 days. This means that every 8 days, half of it disappears. If you find iodine-131, it means the explosion happened recently. You cannot blame it on old tests from the 1960s that iodine would be long gone. This was fresh. This was new fission. Dr. Robotham did the math. He calculated the decay rate backward. The timeline pointed directly to late September. It pointed to the exact week that the Vela satellite woke up screaming. The mood in the laboratory shifted from routine boredom to intellectual alarm. In science, an anomaly is exciting. It is a discovery. But in 1979, a nuclear anomaly was dangerous. The data was compiled. The samples were retested. The results were consistent. The thyroids contained iodine-131. It wasn't enough to kill the sheep, or to harm humans who ate the meat. It was infinitesimally small. But legally and politically, it was massive. It proved that a violation of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty had occurred. The Australian scientists prepared their report. They believed they were providing a crucial piece of the puzzle. They believed the Americans would be grateful for the confirmation. They were wrong. When the data reached the political level, the archive chill set in. The United States government was in the middle of its glitch narrative. They were building the case that the satellite had malfunctioned. They were building the case for the MICROMETEOROID. The Australian sheep data was a wrecking ball to that narrative. You can argue with a satellite sensor. You can say it was old, or overheated, or hit by dust. But you cannot argue with a thyroid gland. A thyroid gland doesn't hallucinate. It doesn't have software glitches. It simply follows the laws of chemistry. If there is iodine, there was a bomb. So, the pressure began. The Americans sent their own experts to Australia. They didn't come to congratulate the researchers. They came to critique the methodology. They asked, could the samples be contaminated? Is your equipment calibrated? Could this be leakage from a hospital? The hospital theory was the preferred explanation of the cover-up artists. Iodine-131 is used in medicine to treat thyroid cancer. The skeptics argued that perhaps the sheep had grazed near a sewage outlet from a hospital, or that the lab had cross-contaminated the samples with medical waste. But the sheep were from open pastures in rural Victoria and Tasmania, hundreds of miles from the nearest nuclear medicine facility, and the levels were uniform across a wide area. A hospital leak would be localized. This was a blanket. The scientists stood their ground. They knew their protocols were sound, but science is fragile when it collides with geopolitics. The dispute over the sheep became a quiet war of statistics. The White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP, convened a panel. They looked at the Australian data and decided to classify it as statistical noise. Statistical noise is a powerful term. It dismisses reality by claiming it is just a random fluctuation. It is a way of saying, yes, the numbers are there, but we choose not to believe they mean anything. For the Australian scientists, this was professional gas. They were being told that what they saw with their own eyes, on their own instruments, was an illusion. But the biology had one more layer of proof. It wasn't just the iodine, it was the weather correlation. Meteorologists analyzed the rain patterns for those specific days. They found that a low-pressure system had swept across the southern Indian Ocean, passing directly over the Prince Edward Islands, and then depositing heavy rain on the exact districts where the sheep were grazing. The plume trajectory matched perfectly. If the bomb had gone off anywhere else in the Pacific, in Siberia, in Nevada, the wind would not have carried the fallout to Tasmania in that time frame. The geometry was undeniable. That biological evidence is what makes the Vela Incident a modern conspiracy. It isn't a conspiracy of wild theories and aliens. It is a conspiracy of bureaucracy. It is a conspiracy of boring men in suits deciding that a dead sheep's thyroid is inconvenient to the president's foreign policy. The file on the Australian sheep was effectively buried. It wasn't destroyed, but it was sidelined. It was left out of the main reports. It was treated as an outlier. But in the archive chill, we look for the outliers. We look for the data points that were thrown in the trash, that there is a sense of melancholy to this part of the story. The sheep lived their lives, grazed the hills, and unknowingly participated in one of the greatest secrets of the Cold War. They were the silent couriers of the truth. And what about the humans? The farmers in Tasmania? They were never told. They were never warned that radioactive rain had fallen on their land. The levels were too low to cause immediate sickness, but the lack of transparency is chilling. If the government knew there was fallout, did they have a duty to warn the population? Or was the secret of the double flash more important than the right to know? The biological evidence extended beyond Australia, though the data is harder to find. There were reports of thyroid anomalies in New Zealand as well, but New Zealand was even further downwind. The signal was weaker. The sheep in Australia were in the Goldilocks zone, far enough away to be safe, but close enough to catch the scent. The rejection of this evidence had a long-term effect on the scientific community. It taught a generation of researchers that finding the truth isn't enough. You have to be allowed to speak it. Today the samples are gone. The sheep are dust. But the data remains in the archives of the Australian Radiation Laboratory. It sits there, a set of numbers that refuses to fit the official story. When we construct the narrative of the Vela Incident, we usually focus on the satellite, the high-tech eye in the sky. But the satellite was just a machine. It could be argued that it was blinded by a sunglint or a meteor. But biology is redundant. It is messy, but it is honest. Thousands of sheep, across hundreds of miles, do not all develop the same radioactive signature by accident. The probability of that happening by chance is zero. The biological evidence acts as the anchor. It ties the flash to the earth. It proves that something physical, something toxic, something real happened in the atmosphere that night. It wasn't a phantom signal. It was a cloud of atoms. The file was stamped never open, and yet biology opened it for us. The sheep provided the physical receipt for the transaction that happened in the Indian Ocean. As we close this section of the archive, we are left with the uneasy realization that the world is more connected than we think. A secret explosion near Antarctica becomes a biological fact in Australia within days. The wind connects us. The rain connects us. The food chain connects us. There is no such thing as an isolated event. There is no such thing as a secret that stays in one place. The sheep have told their story, but the cover-up required more than just ignoring the biology. It required a plausible alternative. It required a lie so big, so technical, and so boring that people would stop asking questions. They needed to explain away the satellite data. They needed to invent a phantom object in space. We must now turn our attention to the weather balloon lie and the micrometeoroid theory. We must look at how the government tried to rewrite the laws of probability. The biology was real, the explanation was fake, and the gap between them is where the truth is hiding. The most dangerous weapon in a government's arsenal is not a missile. It is not a tank. It is a story. When the truth is too radioactive to handle, when the facts threaten to destabilize the delicate balance of global power, the state does not admit failure. Instead, it invents a new reality. It constructs a narrative so dull, so bureaucratic, and so scientifically plausible on the surface, that the public simply loses interest. On the morning of October 26, 1979, the United States decided that the nuclear flash in the Indian Ocean was not a bomb. They decided it was a mistake. They decided to rewrite the laws of physics to save a treaty. The file was stamped never open. Yet we begin tonight by entering the press rooms where the lie was born. We are going to deconstruct the weather balloon theory. We are going to watch how a terrifying anomaly was transformed into a harmless error. We are going to witness the alchemy of the cover-up, where a double flash of light became a reflection of the sun, and a nuclear explosion became a phantom. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets. Imagine the smell of stale cigarette smoke and cheap coffee. Imagine the sound of teletype machines chattering with wire reports. We are drifting back to a time when information was controlled by a few men in a few rooms. We are entering the echo chamber of Washington, D.C., where the truth goes to die. That when the news of the Vela incident first leaked, the reaction was pure panic. The administration was caught off guard. They had a code red event, but they needed a code green explanation. You cannot tell the American people that a rogue nation has just tested a nuclear weapon and you don't know who it is. That implies weakness. That implies a loss of control. So, the search for an alternative explanation began immediately. It wasn't a scientific search. It was a political scavenger hunt. They needed anything that could explain a double flash of light, without involving uranium. The first candidate was nature. Could it be a superbolt of lightning? The scientists at Los Alamos shook their heads. Lightning is too chaotic. It doesn't have the clean double hump signature. Could it be a meteor? A meteor is a single flash. It burns and dies. It doesn't blink. Then, someone in a meeting room, perhaps looking for the path of least resistance, suggested the sun. The sun is the ultimate source of light. If the satellite was looking at the ocean, and the sun was at the right angle, could it be a reflection? But the ocean is rough. It scatters light. It doesn't act like a mirror. To get a focused beam of light strong enough to trigger the sensors from 70,000 miles away, you need a perfect reflector. You need something smooth. You need something shiny. You need a weather balloon. The weather balloon theory was a masterpiece of It relied on a series of hypothetical events that were so complex, they were almost impossible to disprove. The theory went like this. A high-altitude research balloon was drifting over the Prince Edward Islands. It was spherical. It was reflective. As the satellite passed overhead, the sun hit the balloon. The light bounced off the balloon and hit the satellite's sensor. That explains the first flash. But what about the second flash? The double hump that is the fingerprint of a bomb. The spin doctors had an answer for that too. They suggested that the balloon was damaged. Perhaps it was rippling in the wind. Perhaps a piece of the balloon flapped, briefly blocking the light, and then revealing it again. It was a stretch. It was physically unlikely, but it had one massive advantage. It was boring. A weather balloon is the most mundane object on Earth. It is harmless. It is scientific. By blaming a weather balloon, the government took the terror out of the event. They turned a nuclear crisis into a piece of space junk. The State Department began to float this theory to the press. They didn't say it was a balloon. They used the language of ambiguity. They said, "We are investigating the possibility of a natural phenomenon or a reflection from a satellite or balloon." This is the art of the non-denial denial. You introduce a harmless alternative, and you let the media run with it. The American public, weary from the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal, was ready to believe that the government was incompetent, but they weren't ready to believe the world was ending. The balloon story fit the narrative of government equipment failure. It was comforting. It meant that no one had the bomb. It meant that the safety systems were just glitching. But inside the intelligence community, the engineers were furious. The men who built the Vela satellites knew the difference between a balloon and a bomb. A balloon reflection creates a specular reflection, sharp, intensely bright point of light. It saturates the sensor instantly. It doesn't have the slow thermal cooling curve of a fireball. The graph of a balloon reflection looks like a needle. The graph of a bomb looks like a mountain. Vela 6911 saw a mountain, but the engineers were silenced. Their reports were classified. The only voice the public heard was the voice of the spokesperson standing at the podium, calmly explaining that space is a complicated place, and sometimes, a balloon looks like the apocalypse. The construction of the lie required more than just a theory. It required a breakdown of the truth. The administration had to systematically dismantle the credibility of their own machine, the Vela satellite, which had successfully detected 41 previous nuclear tests without a single error, suddenly had to be painted as unreliable. This is a tactic known as gaslighting the instrument. The officials began to leak stories about the satellite's age. "It's 10 years old," they whispered to reporters. "It's past its warranty. The sensors are degrading. It's practically space junk." They ignored the fact that the satellite was still functioning perfectly. They ignored the fact that the background diagnostics showed system nominal. They created a narrative of decay. If the machine is broken, then the data is garbage. And if the data is garbage, then the bomb didn't happen. But the weather balloon lie faced a major problem: the hydroacoustic evidence. Remember the Navy sensors, the underwater microphones that heard the explosion? You cannot explain a loud underwater thump with a weather balloon. A balloon doesn't make a sound. A reflection of light doesn't shake the ocean floor. That's so. The cover-up had to expand. They had to explain away the sound too. They turned to nature again. Perhaps, the officials suggested, it was a small earthquake, or a whale hitting the sensor, or ice calving off Antarctica. They threw a dozen explanations at the wall, hoping one would stick. The goal was to create confusion equity. If you have one clear explanation, a bomb, everyone believes it. If you have 10 messy explanations, balloon, meteor, whale, earthquake, lightning, people get confused. They tune out. They decide that the truth is unknowable. This is the genius of the archive chill. It uses boredom as a weapon. By flooding the zone with technical jargon and contradictory theories, the government makes the truth feel like homework, and no one wants to do homework. The National Security Council (NSC) became the editors of this story. They filtered the intelligence reports. If a report said probable nuclear event, it was sent back for further review. If a report said inconclusive, it was circulated to the president. This filtration process created a feedback loop. The analysts at the bottom knew what the bosses at the top wanted to hear. They wanted doubt. So, the analysts began to emphasize the uncertainties. They started using words like possibly and conceivably instead of definitely. The certainty of the double flash was diluted, drop by drop, until it became a murky gray soup of data. Meanwhile, the diplomatic channels were working to ensure that the lie held up internationally. The US reached out to its allies. They implicitly told them, "We are treating this as a not. We expect you to do the same." New Zealand, which had detected radiation traces, was pressured to review their findings. Australia, with its radioactive sheep, was told that their data was statistical noise. The alliance of silence was enforced not by threats, but by the polite consensus that rocking the boat was dangerous. The weather balloon lie was also a shield for the president. Jimmy Carter was a moral man. He wanted to tell the truth, but his advisors convinced him that the truth was a luxury he couldn't afford. If he admitted the bomb was real, he would have to act. He would have to sanction Israel or South Africa. He would have to admit that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was a failure. By accepting the lie, Carter bought himself peace. He bought himself an election year without a nuclear crisis. It was a Faustian bargain. He traded the truth for stability. The press swallowed the pill. The New York Times, the Washington Post, they reported the government's skepticism. They quoted the unnamed officials who talked about balloons and meteoroid. The story moved from the front page to page A12, then to page A24, then it disappeared. The anomaly was normalized. The impossible became the mundane. But a lie, no matter how well constructed, leaves a residue. It leaves a gap in the logic of history. The weather balloon lie was successful in 1979, but it failed the test of time. As the years passed, the absurdity of the explanation became clear. Statisticians looked at the probability. What are the odds that a weather balloon would be in the exact right spot, at the exact right second, to reflect the sun into a satellite that scans the entire hemisphere? And what are the odds that this reflection would perfectly mimic the double hump signature of a nuclear bomb? And what are the odds that this would happen at the exact same moment a hydroacoustic signal was detected? The odds are 1 in 100 billion. To believe the lie, you have to believe in a miracle. You have to believe that the universe conspired to trick the United States government. The legacy of the weather balloon lie is cynicism. It taught the intelligence community that science is subservient to politics. It taught the public that official denials are often just sophisticated fiction. The scientists who worked on the Vela program never accepted it. They went to their graves insisting that the machine worked. They wrote papers, often classified, dismantling the balloon theory point by point. They pointed out that the wind direction on that day would have blown any balloon away from the reflection zone. They pointed out that there were no scheduled balloon launches in that area, but their voices were trapped inside the classified world. They were shouting into a soundproof room. Today, when we look back at the Vela Incident, the weather balloon stands as a monument to the Cold War's absurdity. It is a symbol of how desperate the superpowers were to maintain the illusion of control. They would rather blame a piece of rubber floating in the wind than admit that the nuclear club had expanded without their permission. The file was stamped, never open, and the lie was the lock on the door. It was a lock made of words, constructed to keep the public out, and the ghosts in. The balloon didn't exist. The sun glint didn't happen. The micrometeoroid didn't hit, there was only the flash, the cold, hard, undeniable light of a split atom, and the silence that followed was not the silence of peace, it was the silence of a held breath. We have dismantled the lie. We have seen the desperate lengths the government went to. But to truly understand the depth of the cover-up, we must look at the official conclusion. We must look at the final report that sealed the tomb of the truth. We must look at the Rowena panel. The scientists were paid to find a glitch, and when they couldn't find one, they invented one. Science is usually described as the pursuit of truth. It is the process of stripping away bias, fear, and politics to reveal the raw mechanics of the universe. But in the winter of 1979, science was asked to do something else. It was asked to provide an alibi. When the United States government found itself trapped between the undeniable data of a nuclear explosion and the unbearable consequences of admitting it, they did not call the generals, they called the professors. They convened a panel of the brightest minds in physics and engineering, and they gave them a task that was never written down but was understood by everyone in the room. Find the glitch, find the error, make the bomb go away. The file was stamped never open. Yet we begin tonight by walking into the windowless conference room of the ad hoc panel on the September 22 event. We are going to sit at the table with the men who were paid to doubt. We are going to watch how the scientific method was inverted, used not to prove a discovery, but to disprove a reality. We are going to witness the birth of the Rowena report, the document that turned a nuclear crisis into a statistical footprint. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets. Imagine the smell of chalk, dust, and pipe tobacco. Imagine the sound of rustling paper and the scratching of fountain pens. We are entering the academic sanctuary of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Here, the chaos of the ocean is reduced to neat columns of numbers. Here, the flash is just a data point to be argued over. The panel was chaired by Dr. Jack Ruin, a brilliant electrical engineer from MIT. He was a man of integrity. A man who understood radar and sensors better than almost anyone alive. Around him sat a collection of distinguished scientists: Luis Alvarez, a Nobel laureate, Richard Garwin from IBM, and others. These were not government stooges. These were giants of the intellect. And that is what made the cover-up so effective. If you want to hide a lie, you don't hire a liar. You hire a genius. And you give him incomplete data. You ask him to solve a puzzle, but you hide the corner pieces. The mandate given to the Rowena panel was technically neutral. Review the data from the Vela satellite and determine the cause of the signal. But the context was anything but neutral. The White House made it clear that a nuclear conclusion would be inconvenient. The burden of proof was shifted. Usually, in intelligence, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a duck. But for the Rowena panel, the bomb had to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. And in science, you can always find a doubt if you look hard enough. The panel began their work by dissecting the double flash. They looked at the graph that Vela 6911 had beamed down. They admitted, right from the start, that it looked exactly like a nuclear explosion. The timing was perfect. The ratio of the two light pulses was perfect. But then they found the loose thread. The Vela satellite had two sensors, YC and YV. They were mounted inches away from each other. They were looking at the same event. Therefore, they should have recorded the exact same intensity of light, but they didn't. One sensor recorded a slightly brighter flash than the other. To a layman, this is a minor detail. Maybe one sensor was dirty. Maybe one was calibrated differently. But to the Rowena panel, this discrepancy was the golden ticket. They argued that if the light source was distant, like a nuclear bomb on the surface of the Earth, the light rays would be parallel when they hit the satellite. Both sensors would see the same thing. But if the light source was close, like a tiny meteoroid hitting the satellite itself, or a piece of debris floating a few feet away, then the angle would be different. One sensor might see it brighter than the other. This was the parallax argument. It was a brilliant, sophisticated, geometric argument, and it became the cornerstone of the denial. The panel latched onto this. They began to build a model of a zoo event. They hypothesized that a micrometeoroid had collided with the satellite, knocking loose a piece of skin or paint. This debris then drifted into the field of view of the sensors, reflecting sunlight. That it was a magic bullet theory for space junk. It required a piece of debris to tumble, flash, hide, creating the valley, and then flash again, creating the second peak. In perfect synchronization with the timing of a nuclear bomb. The probability of this happening was astronomical, but the panel argued that space is a big place, and strange things happen. They argued that improbable is not the same as impossible. By focusing entirely on the physics of the satellite, they ignored the context of the world. They ignored the South African ships. They ignored the Israeli connection. They treated the satellite as if it existed in a vacuum, disconnected from geopolitics. The Ruina panel's investigation was not a collaborative effort with the intelligence community. It was a battle. On one side were the academics, armed with their theoretical models of On the other side were the engineers at Los Alamos and the analysts at the Defense Intelligence Agency DIA. The Los Alamos team was furious. They had built the machine. They knew Vela 6911 better than anyone. They knew why the sensors showed different intensity. It wasn't because of a meteoroid. It was because of radiation darkening. The satellite had been in space for 10 years. It had been bombarded by cosmic rays. The glass lenses of the sensors had darkened over time, like old plastic left in the sun, but they hadn't darkened evenly. One lens was simply foggier than the other. When the Los Alamos engineers applied the correction for this aging process, the discrepancy vanished. The two signals lined up perfectly. The parallax argument collapsed. The bomb came back, but the Ruina panel rejected this correction. They stuck to their theory. They were looking for a way out, and the glitch was their exit strategy. Then there was the problem of the hydroacoustic data. Remember the Navy sensors that heard the underwater explosion? The Ruina panel had to explain that away too. They couldn't deny the sound existed. It was on the tape, so they attacked the timing. They argued that the sound signal might have been a reflection of an earthquake from a different part of the ocean, bouncing off the Antarctic shelf. They argued that the correlation in time with the flash was just a coincidence. Coincidence became the most used word in the report. A flash of light that looks like a bomb. Coincidence. A sound in the ocean at the same time. Coincidence. Radioactive sheep in Australia. Contamination or coincidence. A South African naval exercise in the area. Coincidence. To believe the Ruina report, you had to believe in a universe governed by a series of miraculous, synchronized accidents. You had to believe that nature decided to prank the United States government by mimicking a nuclear test in every possible way, all at once. The panel released its final report in the summer of 1980. The language was carefully chosen. It did not say there was no bomb. It said that the signal contains sufficient internal inconsistency to cast serious doubt on the interpretation as a nuclear event. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic hedging. Serious doubt. That was all the politicians needed. They didn't need proof of innocence. They just needed reasonable doubt. President Carter accepted the report. The State Department cited it as the final word. The Vela Incident was officially reclassified from a nuclear event to a zoo event, but the report left a bitter taste in the mouths of the intelligence professionals. The director of the DIA wrote a classified memo dissenting from the panel's findings. He stated bluntly that the panel was wrong. He stated that the intelligence community remained convinced it was a nuclear detonation. This created a schism in the US government that lasted for decades. There was the White House truth and the real truth. The White House truth was that a meteoroid hit a satellite. The real truth, locked in the vaults of the Pentagon, was that South Africa and Israel had tested a weapon. The psychological effect of the Ruina panel was profound. It demonstrated the power of scientific filibustering. It showed that you could paralyze action by demanding endless analysis. By the time the panel finished its work, months had passed. The immediate crisis was over. The trail was cold. The world had moved on to the Iranian hostage crisis and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The panel served its purpose. It bought time. It acted as a heat shield for the administration. But for the scientists involved, it must have been a strange burden. Men like Luis Alvarez were accustomed to discovering truths, not obscuring them. Did they truly believe the meteoroid theory? Or did they understand that they were performing a duty for the state? Did they convince themselves that preventing a diplomatic meltdown was more important than identifying a flash of light? The concept of the zoo event entered the lexicon of the intelligence world. It became shorthand for "we don't know, and we don't want to know." But the Ruina panel's legacy is also one of archive chill. It represents the freezing of inquiry. When the highest scientific authority in the land declares a subject closed, it takes a brave researcher to pry it open again. Funding dries up. Careers are threatened. The official story becomes a concrete wall that is hard to break. Yet, the data remained. The glitch explanation was so fragile that it began to crumble. Almost immediately after the report was published, independent scientists looked at the meteoroid probability again. They calculated that for a meteoroid to create that specific signal, it would have to be a specific size, traveling at a specific speed, and hitting at a specific angle. The odds were calculated at 1 in 100 billion. In comparison, the odds of a pariah state like South Africa, which had uranium and a motive, testing a bomb in a remote ocean, were high. The Ruina panel asked us to bet on the 1 in a billion chance rather than the obvious one. As we look back at the Ruina panel today, we see it not as a failure of science, but as a success of politics. It did exactly what it was designed to do. It neutralized the truth. It reminds us that data is never neutral. Data is interpreted by humans, and humans have agendas. The graph of the double flash didn't change. The numbers didn't change. But the story attached to them changed depending on who was holding the pen. The scientists found their glitch, the politicians found their peace, and the bomb in the Indian Ocean became a ghost. But ghosts have a way of speaking. While the American scientists were busy explaining away the flash, a man in a prison cell in South Africa was preparing to tell a different story. He didn't care about micrometeoroids. He didn't care about light intensity ratios. He cared about the ships he saw leaving the harbor. The Ruina panel tried to close the book on the Vela Incident using math, but they couldn't silence the spies. We must now turn our attention to the human element, to the man who betrayed his country and, in doing so, confirmed the secret that Washington tried so hard to bury. The file was stamped, never open, but the lock is broken. The glitch was alive, the flash was real, and the spy is ready to speak. In the Library of Secrets, some books are burned, some are redacted, and some are locked away in human minds. We have analyzed the satellite data, we have analyzed the radioactive sheep, we have dismantled the weather balloon lie. But the most compelling evidence for the Vela incident does not come from a machine or an animal. It comes from a traitor. It comes from a man who wore the uniform of the South African Navy while secretly serving the Soviet Union. A man who sat in the highest councils of the apartheid regime, listened to the whispers of the generals, and then passed those whispers to Moscow. The file was stamped, never open. Yet we begin tonight by walking down the cold concrete corridor of a maximum security prison. We are going to meet Commodore Dieta. We are going to listen to the testimony of a spy who had nothing left to lose. We are going to hear the story of Operation Phoenix, the codename that connects the flash in the sky to the ships in the harbor. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets. Imagine the smell of damp concrete and stale bread. Imagine the claustrophobia of a cell where the sun never truly shines. We are leaving the open ocean and entering the mind of a double agent. Relax your shoulders. Let the tension fade. We are safe here, observing the history of betrayal from behind the glass. Dieter Gerhardt was not a low-level functionary. He was the commander of the Simonstown Naval Dockyard. This was the strategic heart of the South African Navy. It was the facility where the ships were repaired, where the missions were planned, and where the secrets were kept. Gerhardt had cosmic top-secret clearance. He was a man trusted by the Prime Minister. He was a man who played tennis with the admirals, but he was also Felix. For 20 years, Gerhardt and his wife, Ruth, operated as one of the most damaging spy rings in the Cold War. They photographed documents. They recorded conversations. They smuggled detailed plans of Western military technology to the KGB. Gerhardt was a walk-in. He wasn't blackmailed. He volunteered. He was motivated by a complex mix of anti-apartheid sentiment and arrogance. He believed he was smarter than the system, and for 2 decades he was. But in 1983, the FBI caught a Soviet handler in New York. The dominoes began to fall. Gerhardt was arrested in a hotel room in New York, flown back to South Africa, and thrown into a cell. He was interrogated for months. He was stripped of his rank. He was erased from the history books he had helped to write. That it was from this darkness, years later, that he began to speak about the flash. When the Berlin Wall fell and the apartheid government collapsed, Gerhardt was eventually released. And he didn't mince words. When asked about the mysterious event of September 22, 1979, he didn't talk about meat. He didn't talk about glitches. He said, simply and flatly, it was a joint Israeli-South African nuclear test. Gerhardt claimed that the operation was codenamed Operation Phoenix. The name itself is symbolic, the mythical bird rising from the ashes. It fits the psychology of 2 pariah states, South Africa and Israel, feeling isolated and threatened, seeking to rise above their enemies with the ultimate weapon. According to Gerhardt, the logistics were clear. He stated that Israeli ships had docked at Simonstown. He stated that the weapon was not a bomb dropped from a plane, but a device fired or detonated from a ship. He described a level of cooperation that went far beyond political handshakes. It was a merger of military capabilities, but the most chilling detail Gerhardt provided was about the weather. The official cover-up relied on the idea that the weather was bad, so no one could have seen anything. But Gerhardt knew the operational details. He claimed that the planners of the test had been waiting for a storm. They wanted bad weather. They wanted the cloud cover to hide the flash from the American Vela satellites. But nature is unpredictable. Gerhardt said that just as the device detonated, there was a break in the clouds, a hole in the overcast. This detail is critical. It explains why the satellite saw it. It explains why the Americans were caught off guard. The test was designed to be invisible, but a random act of meteorology exposed it. It confirms the Murphy's law of the Vela Incident. Anything that could go wrong for the conspirators did go wrong. Gerhardt's testimony provides the human intelligence that was missing from the Ruina report. The scientists looked at graphs and saw ambiguity. The spy looked at the schedule and saw a plan. The credibility of a spy is always a fragile thing. When a man makes a career out of lying to his friends, why should we believe him when he speaks to history? The American and South African governments tried to discredit Dieter Gerhardt. They painted him as a traitor, a mercenary, and a drunk. They dismissed his claims about the Vela incident as the ramblings of a man trying to stay relevant. But there is a principle in intelligence analysis. Look at who believes the spy. The Soviet Union believed him. For 20 years, the KGB paid him, protected him, and acted on his information. They considered him one of their most valuable assets. If the KGB, the most paranoid organization on Earth, trusted Gerhardt's eyes and ears, then his account of Operation Phoenix carries weight. Gerhardt claimed that the test was a clean explosion, a tactical weapon designed to minimize fallout. This aligns perfectly with the confusion over the missing debris. He claimed that the Israelis provided the technology and the South Africans provided the logistics. This aligns perfectly with the trade data we discussed earlier. Every piece of his story fits into the puzzle holes left by the official narrative. There is a specific kind of archive chill that comes from listening to a man like Gerhardt. It is the realization that the world is run by people who know the truth, but agree to lie about it for the sake of stability. Gerhardt was a villain, in the eyes of his own government. But on this specific topic, he became the only honest man in the room. He described the atmosphere at Simonstown in the days leading up to the test. The tension, the sudden arrival of foreign specialists, the clamping down on communications. These are the mundane details that give a story the texture of reality. A liar invents grand theories. A witness remembers the smell of the nervous sweat in the briefing room. Gerhardt also shed light on the silence of the Soviet Union. He implied that Moscow knew about the test because he told them. The Soviets knew exactly what happened. They knew it was a joint operation, but they chose to hold on to that card. They let the Americans squirm in confusion. They let the Ruina panel tie itself in knots. In the game of the Cold War, knowledge was ammunition. You don't fire all your ammunition at once. You save it. Dieter Gerhardt is an old man now. The Cold War is over. The apartheid regime is dust. The Soviet Union is a memory. But his testimony stands as a monolith in the historical record. It is the counterweight to the weather balloon. On one side of the scale, you have a frantic US government claiming a micrometeoroid hit a satellite. On the other side, you have the commander of the naval base claiming he helped launch the ships. Which story feels heavier? Which story feels like the truth? The spy in the dungeon broke his silence, and in doing so he broke the seal on the file. He gave us the name, Phoenix. He gave us the method, a ship in the storm, and he gave us the reason, to be feared. The Vela incident was not a glitch. It was a climax of secret diplomacy. It was the moment when the hidden alliances of the world briefly stepped into the light. We have now examined the physics, the biology, the politics, and the spies. The picture is almost complete. But there is one final chapter. We must look at what remains today. We must look at the redacted files that are still withheld from the public in 2025. We must look at the missing data that the US government still refuses to declassify. The flash is gone, the sheep are dead. The spy is free, but the archives are still holding on to the last pieces of the puzzle. We are approaching the end of the file, but the final pages are blacked out. What are they still hiding? Time is usually the enemy of secrets. As years turn into decades, the people involved die, the governments change, and the reasons for lying fade away. Normally, the archives open their doors, and the truth walks out into the light. But the Vela incident is different. It is a ghost that refuses to be fully declassified. In 2016, a massive cache of documents was released by the National Security Archive. Historians waited breathlessly to finally see the smoking gun, but when they opened the digital files, they found something else. They found a story told in silence. They found pages where the truth was not written in ink, but in the black bars that covered it. The file was stamped, "Never open." Yet we begin tonight by scrolling through the digital remains of the cover-up. We are going to read between the lines of the 2016 declassification. We are going to look at the memos that were released, and more importantly, at the paragraphs that were deleted. We are going to explore why, nearly 50 years later, the United States government is still afraid of a flash of light in the Southern Ocean. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets. Imagine the dry air of a climate-controlled vault. Imagine the smell of ozone and dust. We are moving from the messy, wet world of the ocean to the dry, precise world of the archivist. Here, the explosion is not measured in kilotons, but in kilobytes. The 2016 release was significant because it destroyed the ambiguity narrative. For decades, the public line was that the intelligence community was divided. The government claimed that no one really knew what happened, but the documents tell a different story. They reveal that in the days immediately following the flash, there was no division, there was consensus. One memo written by a senior analyst at the CIA states plainly, the signal was consistent with a nuclear explosion. It doesn't say maybe, it doesn't say possibly. It uses the language of certainty. A former ambassador and nuclear negotiator captures the mood perfectly. He writes about a meeting where the scientists tried to sell the zoo event theory. He describes the skepticism in the room. He notes that the explanation felt thin. These documents prove that the weather balloon and micrometeoroid theories were not conclusions reached by honest inquiry. They were masks worn by desperate men. But the true chill of the archive comes from what is not there when you read the declassified files. You encounter the black bar, the redaction in the world of archive chill. The redaction is a character in the story. It is a visual representation of silence. There are documents discussing the South African Navy. The text flows smoothly, describing the ships, the dates, the exercises, and then blackness. A solid block of ink covering 3 paragraphs. What is under the black bar? Is it the name of an Israeli observer? Is it the serial number of a weapon? Is it the transcript of a radio interception where a captain confirms the detonation? The government claims these redactions are necessary to protect sources and methods. They argue that even 50 years later, revealing how we caught the signal might endanger current operations. But historians suspect a different motive. They suspect the black bars are hiding the diplomatic complicity we discussed earlier. They are hiding the names of the Americans who helped bury the truth. One of the most frustrating aspects of the 2016 release is the missing data from the hydroacoustic sensors. We know the Navy heard the sound. We know the Air Force Technical Applications Center, AFDAC, analyzed it. But the raw audio files, the original tapes, they are gone. Or they are still locked in a vault so deep that even the Freedom of Information Act cannot reach them. This missing data is the phantom limb of the Vela Incident. We can feel it. We know it was there, but we cannot touch it. This deliberate erasure suggests that the evidence was too good. If the sound recording was ambiguous, they would have released it. They would have said, "See, it sounds like a whale." The fact that they are hiding it suggests that it sounds exactly like what it was, a bomb. The declassification also shed light on the internal rebellion within the Carter administration. We now have access to the dissenting memos. Usually, history records the voice of the winner. The Ruina panel won the political battle, so their report became history. But the 2016 files give a voice to the losers, the scientists and spies who refused to sign off on the lie. There is a memo from the Defense Intelligence Agency DIA that is blistering in its critique. It calls the zoo event theory a technical absurdity. It argues that accepting the non-nuclear explanation sets a dangerous precedent. It warns that if we allow nations to test bombs in secret and get away with it, the entire framework of nuclear deterrence collapses. Reading these memos is like listening to a ghost shouting in an empty room. You can feel the frustration of the author. You can feel their professionalism being crushed by political expediency. The 2016 files also confirm the intense interest in the Israeli connection. There are multiple requests from the White House to the CIA asking for information on Israeli nuclear capabilities during that specific month. Why would the president ask about Israel if he thought it was a meteoroid? The questions themselves are evidence. The search terms used by the analysts, Dimona Joint Task Force, Tritium, reveal what the government was actually worried about. They weren't worried about space junk. They were worried about their allies going rogue. But perhaps the most haunting document is a simple statistical analysis of the satellite's health. The Ruina panel claimed the satellite was broken. The 2016 files contain the maintenance logs. Vela 6911 continued to operate for years after the incident. It continued to provide reliable data. It didn't suffer a catastrophic failure. It didn't go blind. It saw the flash, reported it, and then kept on watching. The machine was innocent. The interpretation was guilty. So where does this leave us? The 2016 declassification was supposed to be the final chapter. It was supposed to close the book. Instead, it just highlighted the missing pages. It proved that the cover-up was not a heat-of-a-moment decision, but a sustained 40-year policy of information suppression. It reminds us that the archive is not a neutral place. It is a battleground. It is where the state fights to control the memory of the past. The black bars on the pages are not just ink. They are the shadows of the bomb. They are the lingering fallout of an explosion that officially never happened. We have traveled through the night. We have seen the flash. We have heard the silence. We have touched the radioactive grass. And now, we have read the redacted files. The story of the Vela incident is a story of the limits of truth. Physics can detect a bomb. Biology can record it. Spies can confess to it. But if the powers that be decide to look away, the truth remains a ghost. But ghosts do not disappear just because you close your eyes. We are at the end of the journey. It is time to step back and look at the whole picture. It is time to summarize the mystery and let it settle into the archives of your mind. History is often presented as a series of facts, dates, names, battles, treaties. We are taught that the past is solid, like stone. But the Vela incident teaches us that history is actually more like water. It is fluid. It can be shaped by the container it is poured into. It can be evaporated by silence. It can be frozen by fear. On September 22, 1979, the laws of physics collided with the laws of politics. Physics said bomb. Politics said glitch. And for 45 years, the world has agreed to live in the space between those two words. We have spent the last few hours dissecting the anomaly. We have looked at the classified sensors, the erased tapes, and the encrypted alliances. The file was stamped never open. Yet we begin tonight by closing the cover. We are placing the final seal on the ghost detonation. We are standing at the edge of the known world, looking back at a flash of light that technically, officially, and legally, never happened. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room powering down. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets. The journey through the archive is complete. The evidence has been presented. The witnesses have spoken. Now only the atmosphere remains. Let the details fade. Let the dates blur. We are left with the feeling of the event, the cold dread of the ocean, and the silence of the spy. The ghost detonation is the ultimate paradox of the nuclear age. It is an event that is simultaneously the most observed and the most denied. Think of the satellite. Vela 6911. It was a machine built to tell the truth. It did its job. It saw the fire, but its reward was to be called broken. It drifted in the graveyard orbit for years, a silent sentinel that no one believed. Think of the sheep in Australia. They grazed on the hills, absorbing the fallout of a war that wasn't happening. They carried the secret in their blood. Think of the scientists on the Ruina panel. Brilliant. Men who were forced to look at a mountain and call it a molehill. They constructed a labyrinth of mirrors to hide the reflection of the bomb. The secret has been kept for 45 years, not because it is hard to understand, but because it is hard to accept. To accept the Vela incident is to accept that the systems we trust, the treaties, the oversight, the democracy are fragile. It is to accept that two small nations, with enough determination and enough uranium, could trick the superpowers and change the balance of the world. The flash was the ghost. It appeared, it terrified the watchers, and then it vanished. It left no crater. It left no ruins. It left only a question mark in the history books that as you drift towards sleep, imagine the Prince Edward Islands tonight. They are still there. The wind is still blowing over the black rocks. The waves are still crashing against the shore. The ocean has washed away the isotopes. The wind has scattered the dust. The silence has returned. The world is full of secrets. Most of them are locked in vaults. But some, like the Vela incident, are locked in the open air. They are hidden in plain sight, protected by the sheer boredom of the details. We have opened the archive. We have read the file. And now, we return it to the shelf. The light is gone. The water is calm. The archive is closed.